listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. It's October 1st, just past 7 a.m. Eastern, and we are getting into headlines. First up in COVID stats. Yesterday in the United States, there were 116,000 new COVID cases reported, along with 2,744 deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 111,210 cases per day. That is still a decrease of 26% from the average 2 weeks earlier. Third day in a row of 26% decreases, that number exactly. Anyway, 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and now 65%, up from 64% yesterday, 65% of residents have received at least one dose. So these are the effects of the mandate I see kicking in, which is like 1%, something like that. And, you know, it'll probably increase over time, but there you go. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,458,265 people across the United States. It has killed 697,988 people in the U.S. In national political news, we have a government today. With only hours to spare, President Biden signed legislation that would avoid a government shutdown and keep it funded through December 3rd. However, the two parties could not come to an agreement on other bills that were under consideration yesterday, namely the infrastructure bill. And, well, that has been delayed. Governor Gavin Newsom has authorized the return of California property to descendants of a black couple who were run out of Manhattan Beach almost a century ago, giving reparation advocates a hope for achieving their goals in California. In international news, Kosovo and Serbia have come to a brokered deal on a border conflict that brought up old tensions after Kosovo last week sent special police to the border to remove Serbian license plates from cars entering the country. A move, they said, matched one made by Serbia following the 2008 independence war. Protesting that rule, local Serbians blockaded the border with trucks. Near Afghanistan's second largest city, the Kandahar province Central General Prison is currently populated by hundreds of men, most of whom are drug addicts. Swept from the streets of the city, only 10% of the approximately 700 people in the prison are convicted criminals, with the rest being, again, drug addicts that the Taliban has picked up from the streets since they've taken power. A new study has warned that China's population could halve within the next 45 years. This comes after years of trying to control the amount of children families have. It worked really well, reportedly. The current birth rate was 1.3 children for each woman, well below the level needed to stop the population from falling. They've tried to reverse that by increasing the number of children that people can have, and that hasn't been working well enough. They're still pretty low there. And in Earth and Science news, the FAA will be looking into Jeff Bezos' company, Blue Origins, as multiple former employees have come out saying the company regularly engages in unsafe practices involving federal export control regulation. Interesting. And there are a lot of holidays today. I will think about these in a later hour to get back to this one. With that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So I went over there are a couple of big articles actually today, but the most relevant national political one, which of course is what happened in Congress yesterday. Mm-hmm. So government's not getting shut down, which is good, right?
All things being equal, that's good.
And then we've been talking about this like crazy yesterday. We'll be talking about it later this morning. What do you think about the other side of things?
Well, I mean, she didn't have the votes. I mean, you know, everybody at that point should have been clear that they didn't have the votes. It had been going on for 3.5 months or so, like 4 months, that it's both or it's nothing. It's both or it's nothing. And it is very screwy that you end up with, look, it's very strange to have this level of unity in the Democratic Party among moderates, centrists, et cetera, and lefties, and to have basically two Democrats in the Senate to basically tank the entirety of the thing. From the standpoint of Pelosi is a big vote counter, And, she knows that if 50 members of her party say no, there's no chance of passing. I mean, the Republicans are not going to help her put the $3.5 trillion over the finish line. And so what she ends up with is basically a party that is in revolt. And so Sanders was like, yep, got to kill that bill in the House. It's already passed the Senate. Got to kill it. And all of the lefties, yep, got to kill it. You know what's up. You know what's up for grabs. And so Pelosi, to save herself this level of humiliation from basically, a midnight vote being voted down, she pulls the bill. Supposedly, they're opening up again this morning. And so I don't know what's going to be different between this morning and last night. And look, I don't think it's going to be enough for them to have just an oral, yeah, we'll do that in good faith. That's not going to work. They're going to require something that's so much more, that's a bit more significant in order to get basically the people to back the bipartisan bill. Because the moment that they back the bipartisan bill, all leverage basically falls out the bottom of it all. So, I have no idea how Pelosi is going to get this over the finish line. They said they're going to bring it up today. This is one of those things we're going to wait and see. But I had zero belief that thing was going to pass last night.
Just based on the number of people who'd said they wouldn't let it pass.
Yeah. There were so many. I mean, and that's the other weird part. When we were talking to Michael Goodwin yesterday, Michael Goodwin's like, I don't understand why Biden is allowing this. And that's what I kept trying to explain to him. This is not Biden allowing anything. Biden, Schumer, Pelosi, all of them sees this as part of their agenda. How much longer is Pelosi going to be in Congress? I mean, she was supposed to be out, the next time around. And when you look at Schumer, I don't know how much longer Schumer is going to be there. And Biden is clearly on his way out. Biden still, barely has the gumption, the strength to keep his body upright for a period of, hour or so. And so all of these guys are looking at this as, this is going to be my legacy. This is going to be what I'm going to be known for. We're going to build back better. Again, that's Biden's words. That's nobody else's words. And the stuff that he basically ran on and the stuff that he basically wants in these bills, well, one is the hard physical infrastructure. The other one is basically dealing with this notion of the public. And so he looks at it as his legacy. I mean, this is not something. Put it this way, the squad with their 6 or 8 members don't have enough force, power, or anything to push any of these guys to do any of this stuff. As many moderates that are in that party, as many of these guys who basically have marginalized the left for decades, they're not pushed for this. They look at it and say, this will help us keep our seats. Not just help us keep our seats, it allows us to get across, hey, look at what we've done. We've done something. You can feel what we've done in your wallet. Put us back in office. We're not these corporatists, et cetera, et cetera. This is their way of trying to, I don't know, the tweak the wheel of sorts. And so they're not being forced. They're not being cajoled. Nobody is hitting them over the head. Nothing like that. All of them are on the same page, believing this is in their best interest to pass it, moderates included. And so he's not being forced. This is one of those things where this is what he wants. And so it breaks down to basically 2 members of the party that are at odds. Very weird stuff. And by the way, if Sinema, if she honestly believes that at the end of this process, if she kills Biden's economic agenda, that she is going to have any value as a lobbyist, any value as some kind of, corporate hack, she's on drugs. I mean, right now, they're trying to primary her back in Arizona. There's a vote of no confidence that they're basically planning. And on top of that, if you kill your president's agenda, and if you think of the number of Congress or the members of Congress, moderates and everybody else who's on the front line, they may lose their seats if Biden's agenda tanks, not to mention Biden himself. She will have no credibility in the party at all at that point. And so she may think that she's untethered from the rest of the party or that there's no leverage to be used against her. Let her tank the agenda. See what happens.
But maybe here's another way of looking at this too. So if we go with your model that the Democrats are okay with this being held up, that because they're trying to get what they want, and then you have a couple of holdouts in the Senate, notably that we've been talking about, but maybe we can focus on Sinema. We've been talking about Manchin quite a bit, but if Sinema is the main lobbyist here, and Manchin is more of a true believer when it comes to what's inside the bill, but another way of looking at this, okay, we're thinking of it in terms of from Congress's perspective, but let's think about it from like the business community's perspective, from the lobbyist perspective for a second. They want to drag this bill out, knowing that they have some leverage over what happens with it. Either kill it or just drag it out for as long as possible to get concessions for what they want. That's another side of this whole process. The more that both of these bills are held up, the more that the negotiations can impact their contents. And so you have these, if I'm right here and I'm not going out on too far of a limb, both parties here have perverse and sort of contradictory incentives. On the one hand, the business community is happy with this taking a while because they're not perfectly satisfied with it and they want to get concessions out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side, you have the political system that's also trying to use this, obviously, to negotiate, to draw this out, and to use whatever power they have. And some people want it just to pass. But on both ends, there are reasons to make this take a long time, right? Is that a fair appraisal?
Well, I think, let me see. I think the party wants to get this over with as soon as possible. Like, I don't think, because they want to be able to use this for the midterms. They believe that the only way they're going to be able to hold on to their seats in the midterms is basically to show, look at what we've done. Look at our thing that we've accomplished.
Totally.
The business community, yes, they want to drag this out or kill it, one or the other. And that's why they were giving cinema all of those checks and whatnot. Basically, the people she was lobbying with or people she was basically getting money from were people who wanted to kill this bill.
But crucially, I mean, let's go back to Manchin.
Yeah.
He would be one of the people who's trying to act, I'm guessing, as a sort of intermediary between the two parties, between the Republicans and the Democrats. He leans right.
Yeah.
He's trying to draw this out so that he can change the contents of the bill, acting effectively on behalf of the Republican side of things in terms of thought, right?
Maybe. I mean, for the bipartisan bill, Manchin was heavily involved in crafting the bipartisan agreement, meaning getting the 10 Republicans on board in order to kind of get the thing over the finish line. So from his standpoint, kind of, yeah. I mean, it's a deep red state. So on some level, he's protected from it. He is an advocate for like coal and whatnot, despite the fact of climate change and everything else. I mean, even some of the provisions he tried to put into this bill, it was like, yeah, you can't ban coal. It's like, what? What are you talking about? Like, because, you know, of course, the Democrats are going to be against anything, but you can't necessarily ban coal. But he will be, I would say, between all of the Democrats, he would probably be the one that would be more of a mediator when you're looking for this kind of bipartisan reconciliation, this bipartisan agreement or consensus on a particular
thing. That's kind
of
what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
He would be
that guy.
He would be the guy, and he's the one who's willing to take arrows or whatever, just because it's not that big of a deal, and it's probably good for his base. His base likes seeing what he's doing in Congress too. They're like, oh, you know, they lean right as well. And so they're like, wow, our guy's really standing up for something or something like that.
Yeah, he's been able to live. And people, I've heard a lot of people make the argument that basically it's like, well, look, if Manchin wasn't there and you had a Republican, you wouldn't even get that, you know, whatever that random vote that you may get every so often.
Yes.
And so I've heard that argument. You know, the thing with West Virginia, it's coal country in some respect. And Democrats shoot themselves in the foot when they, you know, it's like, hey, those people just need to learn to write code. What? No, as somebody who used to be a software engineer, it's not that easy. You can't just flippantly tell people to write code. And yeah, when people's individual needs are put up to the, you know, on contests, you're going to lose. Like nobody is going to give away their jobs in order for somebody to have this vague thing of climate change that's kind of out there. That's X amount of years.
It's what we're talking about with Joel Siegel.
Exactly.
A little while back.
People aren't going to do that. And it's unreasonable to believe that they are going to do that. And even if you want to say, well, they should, well, yeah, a lot of shoulds should happen, but that's not the reality of things. No, the only way to really deal with West Virginia would be to have some kind of jobs program or some kind of conversion over to something else where that industry, where those people don't necessarily lose, and I've been saying this for years, don't necessarily lose their livelihoods or their jobs as West Virginia turn into something else. I mean, for the longest time, West Virginia is like, what, one of the poorest, one of the most undereducated, et cetera. And for the most part, they have powered this nation. And so it's this weird thing of like, yeah, thanks for all of the coal, thanks for all of the black lung, thanks for all of that stuff that you've given us over the course of these decades, but we don't need you now, and so you need to go and learn to write code. That's bogus. No, and that's not necessarily going to work. And West Virginia will stay a red state for as long as that state feels under threat without any kind of compensation for what they need to turn into. So
yeah.
Manchin is the best you're going to get, at least for the short term. By the same token, let's be clear, though. West Virginia still backs this plan. So there's a poll from West Virginia voters on talking about tax hikes and everything else. Now, Cinema basically came out and was like, yeah, I'm not for any of these tax hikes. I don't want to raise corporate taxes or anything else. Now, when she was running, like back in 2008, there's this tweet where she was like, notion that raising taxes on the wealthy is some kind of class warfare thing is nonsense. I'm paraphrasing. She deleted that tweet over the course of the last, let's say, a few weeks or so, which kind of gets across. So wait a minute. Did you change your perspective on that? Did you bait and switch The people in Arizona, when you were kind of giving this kind of rhetoric and then all of a sudden change your mind when the checks start coming in and you were up for contest. Well, in West Virginia, 48% of the people basically backed the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. And again, this is a country or state that Trump won, that is a deep red state. And so it's like, okay, well, that's soft support, but it's support. The moment that you say, hey, we want to raise taxes on corporations and the rich to pay for it, the support jumps to 70%. They're on board for it. This notion of raises taxes on the rich is not, this kind of bizarre concept. The American public, on the whole, backs it. And considering, for the G7 countries, we are literally the cheapest of all of them in regards to taxes. I mean, many of these companies don't pay anything in taxes. The American public gets it. They're on board for it. And so it's aggravating. And Manchin has been making these arguments. I mean, he even made this argument the other day saying vengeful taxation. Vengeful taxation. I love that word, vengeful taxation. And then he made this other thing saying that he doesn't want an entitlement society. It's like, yeah, because, elderly people getting their teeth fixed and their eyeglasses, total entitlement society, or kids getting lunch over the course of the thing, total entitlements. It's aggravating, but look, it's politics, right? And in this case, we're going to see today whether or not Joe Biden's agenda is going to, it's in flux. It's in flux. I mean, what do you think about it? Do you think, this is one of those things where Biden, if he wants his agenda to get through, he should have been asserting himself all the way through. When it was the $15 an hour thing, where he kept calling these people heroes, and it was like, oh, we 15 less is a starvation wage. All of these clips and all of these quotes, and then the moment that there's any little pushback, oh, we can't do anything about the $15 an hour. The parliamentarian is against it, and just scrubs it and moves on. And it's like, dude, you're creating a monster. Like, you've basically given over your agenda entirely. And the question was always looming, does Joe Biden have it in him in order to affect his will on the political space, like a LBJ or something like that, where you grab the congressman in and just browbeat the guy or give the guy some kind of candy in order to bring the guy to your side. And up to this point, it doesn't seem like he has it in him. And so I got to be honest, I don't know what's going to happen to his agenda. Manchin at least gave a number. I think he said 1.5 trillion or something like that. Sinema, mum. She hasn't even explained what she hates about the bill or what she dislikes about it, outside of not raising taxes, which basically kills the entire premise of the bill because the bill was going to be paid for. Because they were basically paying as they went along. That was something that Michael Goodwin said that was right. He was like, well, this wasn't Biden over the course of his terms in Congress. He's right. But by the same token, it is the same guy who's like, we're going to pay for it. Because he's trying to avoid that kind of hit of like, you guys are just spending money without putting this stuff on the company, on the country's dime. Well, he was trying to avoid that. He was going to pay for it. So it's politics, and it's fascinating on some level to have these guys going back and forth. It is very weird to have this level of, I guess, having moderates, having the top brass, the Pelosi, Schumer, Biden moderates on the same page with lefties on this stuff. But here we are. They don't have any leeway. So each person that's in Senate, at the very least, has veto power.
Yeah.
All of them are Joe Manchins.
Yeah. Well, Ed, just coming back to Sinema briefly.
Yeah.
Sinema and Manchin, again, the two holdouts in the Senate who are preventing this thing from going through.
Yeah.
Sinema, just to recall, she came to the public's attention earlier this year with the thumbs down thing over the minimum wage.
Yes.
And so if we go into personalities for a second, we've been treating her purely as like an avatar for lobbyists.
Yeah.
But if we go into her for just thinking about her psychologically, she likes the attention.
Yes, she does.
And so
does Manchin.
Well, and Manchin, I think, would too necessarily. But with her, you've seen her acting kind of, I don't know, extravagantly in a political sense.
Yeah. Or like showboaty.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
She also took a dig at Manchin once.
What do you say?
She also took a dig at Manchin once for his publicity.
Well, that's the thing. For a while there, it was like Manchin was the guy who was standing up to them. And then I think Sinema was like, I got to get in on this or something. So money's included too.
Yeah.
But I think that psychology comes into play as well. No, you were saying what should have been done earlier this year. Just Biden wasn't strong enough to do any of this stuff, frankly. We've been talking about that consistently, but he's an older dude. It seems like maybe he was trying to present a contrast to Trump, or maybe that's too intentional. Maybe he's just tired because he's old. Or maybe even his personality type. He's the kind of guy who wants to hold out and let people do things. And admittedly, Pelosi is a pretty strong woman to have in charge of the party in the House in terms of what the power that she's been able to exert over the party. I want to go back to the stat just because it's super relevant. And I think it should be said a couple of times.
One, right?
Well, the Justin Amash one.
Amash, that's right.
You remember? So basically, I'll pull up the stats right now. But he on Twitter, he posted this thing the other day where up until 2016, 2017, you had a ton of votes. I'll go to it right now. I've got the stats. Basically, a ton of votes consistently throughout American history in the House that were floor offered, that weren't pre-screened by the speaker, basically, for amendments to bills.
Right.
And he starts the stats in 2011 and goes to 2021. So in 2011, it's like, I'll just be brief, 400, I'll call it 400 amendments that, the speaker wouldn't have pre-screened. 2013, it goes way down, starts getting the 60s, the 90s. 2016, it's 29. And then 2017, for the first time in American history, it goes to 0. And it has been at 0 ever since then.
So every bill has been pre-screened.
Every amendment has been pre-screened from that point on. Now, that's under Pelosi.
Yeah.
That's her power. That's
Iron
what she's
fist.
doing.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's her contribution to the process. But you know what? There is another angle that I wanted to throw into this too. It's a little bit outside of this frame. Why? Okay, so economically, you're talking about why can't they spend, dental care for the elderly, for people who are approaching the end of their lives? That seems like the kind of Medicare expense, the kind of thing that should be easy for people to access. You'd want systems in place. Just thinking as a technocrat for a second.
People back. I mean, this is not, like this flaming, socialist policy stuff. This is just basic policy with like, should elderly people or should Medicare be expanded? Yes. They don't hate that. Or at the very least, the notion of the government dealing with being involved in healthcare.
That seems like a fairly minimal expense compared to all of the massive amounts of money that we spend on arms, for instance, that kind of thing. And classically, this is where my mind goes, is where we're choosing to spend our money, what we're choosing to ultimately make our money on. We stopped being a production country back in the 60s, 70s, when we shifted our production overseas in the wake of World War II and trying to inspire growth overseas and prosper from it with trade and investment packages that would enrich the American investment class at home. And so if you look at the balance of production as the world is growing and as things are getting produced, it broadly, of course, flows out of the United States. A lot of the rest of the world had been decimated by World War II. Suddenly, American production was booming, but leaders made choices in a decade or so period following that sort of shifted. It's just the shift of the way that your classes are going to make money. So we shifted out of production, more into services, intellectual economy. A lot of people started financialization. People started to go to college more and do white collar jobs, basically, less producing things. Granted, we still have factories. I'm not trying to dismiss that. We've still been building factories. But if you look at the emphasis, it was on partly doing that, but largely investing overseas, partly out of humanitarian goals and partly to make money, partly to make cash, because they're people who can work for cheaper because their economies have been devastated. The price of labor is super low. There are natural resources spread around the world. It just makes sense in its own way. But the point is, at the same time, what do we need to do if we want to profit off those deals, that big international trade system that we've set up? If we want to be in control of how we make money from this whole network that we've sort of created and protected, whatever, defended against itself, then we need to be in control militarily. And that becomes the shift on the high levels, is keeping control militarily so that we can negotiate the deals that will make our investor class money. And that has become the dominant overriding force in the American political system, the American geopolitical system, the State Department, Pentagon. It's become the through line throughout the whole thing. And there needs to be a seismic shift at the highest level where we're no longer trying to take responsibility for the entire world, trying to take responsibility, spending all this money on our military, that we could be, when our leaders' attention shouldn't be primarily on that. It should be like defending our position, defending our regional interests, helping out our serious allies, that kind of thing, helping out our minor allies even, of course. But like focusing on making America strong, that kind of thing, right? Healthy, like living good, long lives. That should be the goal. That's my spiel.
Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be it. And one of the other points, Biden's plan is $3.5 trillion over 10 years, not 1 year. They keep saying like 3.5 trillion, missing the point that it's 3.5 trillion over 10 years, basically $350 billion a year. We pay $750 billion a year for our military. To touch your point, basically, it's like, what are we spending our money on? Well, we're spending $700 billion annually each year on the military. And with this notion of saying, okay, well, we're going to invest in America $350 billion a year, you get two Democrats saying, no, that's too much. America is not worth that. Whatever. And one last point. There's no point in going into the monologue. Two clips. Joe Manchin has been lying, by the way. The clip that we played yesterday from Joe Manchin was not being honest in that clip. So let's play the first one. This is the clip from yesterday with Joe Manchin.
He said that they need by tomorrow legislative language agreed to. That means
that won't happen.
That won't happen. Why is that?
No, listen, we're not. We haven't been negotiating yet in good faith. No one's been negotiating along those lines with the other party to see what would be acceptable. So all we need to do is pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill, sit down and start negotiating in good faith. That's it.
Senator, progressives feel, though, you're not dealing in good faith. They felt that there was a deal made before.
I never knew about that. Never heard of it.
So you were never part of a deal that linked
never
the two
heard
bills
about
together.
That. About two of them are going to be together?
Yeah.
Why do you think we work so hard to separate them?
Is it possible?
No, it's not possible.
To get a framework by tomorrow.
No, it's not possible.
Not possible to get any framework.
All right, let's stop right there. All right, very clear. I never knew about that. It's like, well, sir, and he says, why do you think we fought so hard to separate them? Well, that means you kind of did know. Just even in the logic of what you just said, why did you fight so hard to separate it? But okay, let's say Joe Manchin, at the very least, he's saying we had no clue that these two bills were going to be tethered together, despite the fact that for the last 4 months, everybody and their mama have been talking about it. The president has been talking about it. Nancy Pelosi has been talking about it. Chuck Schumer. Let's play Biden talking about this very specific point about the two-track strategy that everybody and their mama knew about.
By moving forward with this two-track system, are you putting the bipartisan bill in jeopardy?
Sure, the bipartisan bill was, look, the bipartisan bill from the very beginning was understood there's going to have to be the second part of it. I'm not just signing the bipartisan bill and forgetting about the rest that I proposed. I proposed a significant piece of legislation in 3 parts. And all 3 parts are equally important.
Notice what Biden said. He proposed this. This is what I mean. It's what he wants. And again, Schumer and Pelosi, all of these guys are looking at this as their legacy. So here's the catch. Is Joe Manchin being honest? Joe Manchin comes up and says, this is back in, I believe, in June, Manchin on Biden's two-track strategy approach. It's the only strategy we have is 2 tracks. Reconciliation is inevitable, he says, indicating that Republicans made it inevitable by opposing tax hikes. Manchin says he wants adjustments to the 17 Trump tax cuts. But the key point here is, I don't know what they mean. I didn't know that this was going to be 2 tracks. And yet, here's Manchin, all the way back in June or July. Biden's 2-track approach is the only strategy we have is 2 tracks. Manchin is lying here. Manchin is lying. Look, there should be consequences. And, whether that's going to be visited upon Sinema or Manchin, I think it should be visited on both. At the point where they're trying to crush their own president's agenda, that is disturbing. The constituents in both of those states back this plan overwhelmingly so, especially the Democrats. And the Democrats are the people who they're voting for. And if you're talking about West Virginia, I would make the case that West Virginia needs it, considering it's one of the poorest states that we have. And, in Sinema for a bit, like I said, they're trying to vote of no confidence. That's the first point by our own party. And they are trying to basically primary Sinema. And if she kills her president's agenda, and if she makes it a situation where the moderates or even lefties have a hard way to go because people get so disenchanted with the political process, well, there will be consequences. There will be consequences. So that's my spiel for these two. At the end of the day, you have 2 Democrats that are basically standing in line in front of the entirety of the party, which is just bizarre. And in some circumstances, I wouldn't necessarily be all that bothered by that. But in this very specific case, I kind of am. I don't necessarily there's some really good stuff in these bills. And for the longest time, many of the complaints against Democrats have been, oh, these guys don't believe in anything. These guys don't represent the interests of their constituents. And when you get Biden, which I would say incrementally at the very least is like, hey, I want to actually do something significant for my legacy. And Pelosi is like, yeah, I want to do something for my legacy. And Schumer is like, I want to do something for my legacy. And all of these guys are thinking to themselves, this is the way we stay in power. And you get 2 Democrats that are basically getting all sorts of checks to repudiate it. Yeah, that's disturbing. Disturbing is not the right word for it. Aggravating maybe is a better word for it. But there should be consequences. I don't know what those consequences should be, but there should definitely be consequences.
That sounds like a spark of hope, Jamarl.
Is it? Yes. I got to be honest. I really don't know what's going to happen with this. It could be a situation where they cut the bill, like where you get a situation where Manchin convinces, because what Jim was saying yesterday is correct, and even what Goodwin was saying yesterday is correct. There's a reality to this. That at the end of the day, if you leave a situation where Joe Biden loses both of these bills, they are going to suffer for that. Not just Biden, but also the Democrats that are going to be in Congress. They're going to suffer for that. And so if Manchin is like, I'll give you $2 trillion, regardless of lefties, clenching their teeth, ripping their hair out, they may have to accept it because of just being, back against the wall, especially if they decide that they're not going to back anything else outside of that. And so I don't know what's going to take place. And I don't know if I entirely believe that they would hold the line like that, where they would kill both in perpetuity if anything is offered at all. So Manchin is like 1.5 trillion. It's a throwaway. It's the nonsense he mentioned once before. But is that going to be something they have to come around to if he's not going to vote for anything else? They need each and every vote. And so we'll see. I just have a hard time believing that they're going to kill Biden's agenda all the way through like that. If so, all of them are going to be on the chopping block.
If I was right in my guess, and Manchin's acting as an effective and communicative mediator for this, in other words, he is actively communicating between both parties here and just being the point man who's doing this stuff or whatever, which is maybe, it's totally speculative on my part. But say that's the case, then maybe that's even, there's signs of progress, and that kind of thing could produce useful results. It's just going to be a long, drawn-out theatrical thing where whenever the Biden administration during its term wants to go and get something done, assuming this is a success, and which is regardless, this is going to be their guy. This is going to be the person who takes the attention, which probably is going to be good for him come election time, honestly.
Well, I'll tell you this. But, Manchin was able to get the bipartisan bill. And that was something I didn't even think he was able to pull off. I mean, he was able to get 10 Republicans to sign on to the bill. If you remember back during Obama, it was unyielding opposition to everything. Didn't matter what it was. And so the fact that he's able to get him to sign on some level gets across that the public, even Republicans, get our infrastructure is declining. It's fading. We have bridges falling down.
Most people do.
Yeah.
That's literally what people see.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing that people think about when they live their lives in our civilization, at least our, in our state, whatever, depending on where you're living. Most places, the infrastructure is pretty bad. The roads are pretty low quality. They break down repeatedly, frequently. The road closures are constant, especially in rural regions. Just traffic work comes up, whatever, road work's going on. And like constant road closures, and it takes a long time, frankly. But also, there isn't enough of it being done. There's still loads of places that are just underdeveloped and under-restored. That's obvious
even rail,
to people.
Like this notion of high-speed rail or something like that. I mean, we're still using Amtrak. Europe, bullet trains, China, bullet trains, all of these other countries basically have upgraded.
Totally.
Yeah.
But there's something I wanted to go back to. I understand I've been quiet and you've been taking the lead here, and I've been actively supporting that. But it sounded like there's a spark of hope. It sounded like you were trying to articulate a deep spark of hope that maybe the Biden administration could actually get something done here. That maybe Biden, when you're saying that Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer view this as their legacy, I just wanted to take a minute to think that through, because you could be right. The way that I see this right now is that they are letting the progressives and letting their party do this thing.
Yes.
They care about the result, but specifically with the social spending bill, they might be, that's happening. But I don't think it's going to work ultimately, because you just factually don't have the numbers you have right now, the two people in the Senate who are keeping anything from getting done.
You need everybody.
And so maybe Biden are playing the same game. Biden and Pelosi and Schumer even are playing the same game as the progressives. There's another way of saying this, which is we will show that we're trying to fight for this. We won't necessarily get it accomplished, but at least come election season, we'll say that we fought, that kind of thing. Now, that is going to be a losing strategy, I think. But if they can't get it done, then that might be their best bet. And if they see they can't get it done, then whether they realize it or not, they're just like, their plan A is get it done. Yeah. But that's not going to work. Their plan B is not get it done, but have fought for it real hard.
Oh, that's not going to work
that
either.
kind of thing. And that's the spark of hope.
Yeah.
And I don't want to just be the cynical.
Oh man, cynical one,
but I am.
See, the wild part is, I guess the question is kind of what Jim Sandoval was saying, Scarborough was saying yesterday.
Jim Kavanaugh.
Thank you, was saying yesterday. Are they just going to lick their wounds and accept whatever they can get out of Manchin and Sinema? And is it going to be that? Because the notion of killing Biden's economic agenda all the way through, it's not like Biden has got a ton of stuff done. He hasn't. This was, the thing that they were betting on. Is the Progressive Caucus going to be willing to do it? I don't know. Initially, my thought was, well, credibility demands that they kill us. You've said this for 4 months. At this point, though, I don't know. I mean, he made a really good point. Like, their president is basically is going to rise or fall on the economic agenda that he puts through.
Yeah.
And if they are holding the line and says, look, you're not getting anything done, even though I think that's the best strategy, I think that's the thing that's necessary. I think the pressure should be put on the two people who are at odds with the entirety of the party. But I don't know if they're going to do it. And so typically they fold. They vote present and then cry on the floor.
Well, we'll see. We're going to have the vote later this morning.
Mm-hmm. Supposedly, maybe.
Supposedly after the delay from last night. That's what, of course, sparked this conversation. I'm going to take us into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back talking about woolly mammoths being brought back from death, resurrected. Yeah, again, weird story. We'll be getting into it. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're doing a sort of mixed pre-record commentary. So I'll explain what's going on. But basically, here's the idea. For the next 15 or so minutes, we're going to be playing this clip. I got to sit in a couple of days ago. I was part of a press pool, private digital press pool, basically asking questions of the key founder and the key scientist of this company, Colossal, trying to bring woolly mammoths back from the grave, trying to recreate them using a mixture of woolly mammoth DNA and like other kind of elephant DNA, you know, currently living elephants. They're taking it from you'll hear it partly, I think. They're taking from multiple species of elephants, select strands of DNA, and then genetically combining them to try to resurrect a woolly mammoth and grow it in vitro. Yes, scary. In my opinion, also kind of cool, and I'll get into it. Just briefly setting this up. We're going to be hearing the voices of a couple of people, George Church and Ben Lamb. George Church is an American geneticist, molecular engineer, and chemist, also the co-founder and genetics lead advisor for Colossal, as well as a professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School and founding member of the Weiss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. Also was funded by Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein. If you remember, Jeffrey Epstein was a transhumanist before he allegedly killed himself. And George Church was partly funded from 2005 to 2007 by one of Jeffrey Epstein's foundations. Anyway, the other guy we're going to be hearing from, Ben Lamb, co-founder and CEO of Colossal, serial technology entrepreneur, driven to solve the most complex challenges facing our planet, also co-founded companies including Hypergiant, Conversible, and Team Chaos. So basically, companies with cool names is kind of what I'm hearing. Anyway, these are the two people I'm speaking with. Jamarl, this is, I'll be honest, again, like been a personal interest of mine for a while, specifically bringing back like woolly mammoths and megafauna from the grave. Mm-hmm. I don't know that I would actually go far as to do it, but it's been interesting to me. I'm not sure whether I'm in favor of it or not. We're going to, again, be taking your calls in about 13 minutes, I think. Call it 10. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. But basically, my thinking here, just before we play this clip briefly, is through a combination of things. It seems climatic change and human habitation, humans spreading around the globe. Over a fairly short time span, you had all these massive species of creatures, megafauna basically, that lived on effectively all of the world's continents. A lot of them, whether you're talking about mega sloths, and some of these are still existing. You can think of bison or buffalo.
Mega sloths?
Yeah, you can look it up. Mega sloths in America, in North America. Mega sloths used to roam this land.
Wow.
Or, of course, you have the very familiar woolly mammoth and saber-toothed tigers. Mm-hmm. You have a bunch of large species that went extinct. And the idea is those were sort of like cornerstone species that were maintaining ecosystems, maintaining these ancient prairie ecosystems. And that when we hunted them to extinction, those ecosystems changed dramatically. And that might have been an early global warming event, basically, that actually ended the last ice age, sent a lot of carbon into the atmosphere at this sort of during this longer period of time. and that theoretically, if you want to combat climate change, you could do well to reverse it. Now, whether, in my opinion, this is where it gets weird, whether you do that by resurrecting woolly mammoths or just like using existing animal species in, constructive ways on those ecosystems, that's another question. But very interesting topic regardless. I want to go into it now. Again, this is George Church and Ben Lamb talking about bringing woolly mammoths back from the grave, this company Colossal. Let's get right into it.
My name is Shane Stranahan. I'm a host of Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik based in Washington, D.C. I'll try to keep it to one question, but maybe it'll be an A and B sort of thing. Thank you. And by the way, George Church, Mr. Church, an honor to be able to ask you this stuff. For one thing, beyond woolly mammoths, what other species of megafauna are you looking at potentially rearing in the long run? And then are you considering at this stage moving from megafauna to microfauna? In other words, from these very large animals to much smaller ones that may be extinct, may have been vital keystone species in ecosystems?
I'll just answer a couple of technical and then hand it over to Ben. We're avoiding really small species and predators for the time being because just we're worried about perceptions and controlling them. And, while the large ones, we can track them and they're slow to reproduce. And I think they're just a safer bet for initially. But we are laser focused on the Arctic elephants. We are not, it's not in any of our reasonably short to long-term plans to do others, but we're working with Revive and Restore. And I'll let Ben describe that.
Yeah, as I think we've mentioned maybe in other interviews, we're working closely with an incredible scientific advisory board and different conservation nonprofits, both in genetic rescue, like the great folks like Ryan and Stuart at Revive and Restore, who have been working on this project for quite some time and working with George for a decade plus on it. And they've got an incredible list if you go to their site and look at some of the things that they're focused on from a de-extinction. I think to George's other point, we're myopically focused on Arctic elephants and the cold tolerant attributes, to create functional woolly mammoths. And I think that in turn, we'll probably long-term think about other large megafauna that can help with Arctic rewilding that we can apply those same traits to. Because outside of the rewilding aspects of this and the fixing the degraded ecosystems of the Arctic, another thing that's really important to us is species extension. So how can we take the elephant lineage and give them a home where they're not currently in combat with urbanization and put them in locations that they can not just help from a climate perspective, but also can help from a species preservation perspective of the elephant lineage. And I think that same kind of application could probably be applied to rhinos, but we're not actively working on any additional megafauna or microfauna at this time. But there's also great work being done globally around other species by Revive and Restore and some of these other groups.
I'm just also curious, working with states on regulatory issues, just to sort of get the foundation here. You're speaking about the Arctic. Which countries are you planning on working with on this one? And, in terms of the difficulties, they're going to have concerns. I'm just curious what kind of conversation you're planning on having with them.
Well, we'd like to have conversations with both the governments and the indigenous people of Canada, United States, and Russia. And we don't want this to be just one of them. If the others have objections, we want to satisfy all the major concerns, the consensus concerns, so that they all that any one of them or all three of them can go forward with the enthusiasm of their neighbors. Ben?
Yeah, I just echo that. I mean, Arctic rewilding and methane suppression is a global problem. Climate change is a global problem. It doesn't extend to it doesn't recognize the countries and barriers that humans, have put in place. And so to George's point, we want to work closely with, the indigenous people of those locations, but also with the governments. And we're, this is a long-term, as we mentioned earlier to Saul, this is a long-term project, with long-term, positive applications for humanity. So for us, we want to work closely with governments and with agencies and nonprofits and indigenous groups so that, we hear them, We get advice from them. We make sure that our plans align with their goals along the way. But the good news is we have time, right? So this is a project that has the right event horizon, has the right impact, but also has the right event horizon that we can really, be thoughtful and listen and shape some of our decisions, based on those conversations. But we do look at this as a world collaboration. This is not a U.S. project or a Russian project or a Canadian project. This is a global project. And to your question earlier, how we can also apply these technologies to thoughtful, disruptive conservation to other species, that may not be one of those three countries is also something that is interesting, because we do believe a lot of really great veterinarian technologies will come out of this that we can leverage, to protect other species.
I'm also curious, and we kind of gotten into this through the last couple of rounds of questions, but I'm curious about your long-term plans, ambitions. People are focusing right now on the woolly mammoth, but to be blunt, this could lead to, if you pursue this technology, a complete restoration of the Earth's ecological environments, with the various megafauna that predated human habitation of the planet and the restoration of those species. And I'm not seeing that in the marketing material. I understand you might be a bit hesitant to include that, but as much as you feel comfortable saying, I'm very curious to hear where you want to take this in the long run.
So I think that, I'll let George, chime in on this too, but, for us, and is bringing back, the genes of mammoths and building functional mammoths is a large enough goal to focus on. Arctic rewilding is not we're not just building an e-commerce site, right? It's a hard challenge with, not just the science and the great work on the genocide, but the engineering challenges of how do you do it at scale with artificial wombs and whatnot. So I think we're myopically focused, on that at this time. And then, from a long-term perspective, I think that if you look at the technologies that we're building from a de-extinction toolkit perspective, how can we also help, existing species like the northern white rhino and other species that, are megafauna that are critically endangered or functionally extinct or have recently gone extinct. I think we'll probably look at how we can partner with conservationist groups with technologies that we develop and with the techniques that we develop. It can be helpful. But from a long-term, full de-extinction, we get this question all the time. People, what we found is everyone seems to have their favorite recently or not so recently extinct species. And for us, it's really got to make, ecological sense and make the right sense. The mammoth, to George's earlier points, is targeted for a myriad of reasons, including that, we have a location to put them in. We have an impact that we believe will be positive, for the environment and for the world. And we have the technologies to do it with their closest living relatives. And so we've been pretty thoughtful in the approach on the mammoth. And I think that we've got to have that same level of thought in consideration for any other species that we would consider.
Just one small technical point on that may be relevant is we will be enabling other groups, and we'll hopefully set a good example for how they interact with governments and peoples and ethics. But also, technically, one of the things that's been off the table in the discussions that we've had for the last decade on using molecular tools in conservation has been the possibility of bringing back animals that were much larger than the ones that are alive today. But if the in vitro development in artificial wombs works, and I know that's a big if, but we're counting on it, it will allow a much larger birth of babies that would be too large for modern species. I think that's a small number, but it's particularly comes up again and again. We won't be doing that, but I think the technology we're developing may be suitable for that.
I think he's talking about dinosaurs there, to be blunt. No, I'm kind of kidding, but he could be. Austin's bringing up a couple of points. So first of all, Jamarl, any questions?
No questions. Okay. I mean, we were talking about it once before.
We have talked about it before. Yeah. Austin's bringing up a couple of points I might want to address, and those are good points, Austin. Thanks. 202-521-1320 is the phone number, 202-521-1320. Any questions, comments from the audience? If you want to join the conversation, again, 202-521-1320. A couple of things. I'll start with the second one first, actually. Issues of bonding. So there were other people in the call, of course. They were asking questions. I was just one of the people there. I think there were 4 people asking questions, including myself. Somebody pretty early on brought up the issue of bonding behavior. You can think of animal cultures even. The inherited patterns of behaviors where, like we do, animals grow up usually in the company of other animals of the same species. They have a culture. I don't know how else to put it. It's not nearly as deep of ours, of course, and in the vast majority of cases, it's pretty darn shallow. But still, there's this idea of bonding with your parents, seeing what they do, learning to live in the ecosystem that they would be living in, and learning to do the kinds of things they do in that ecosystem. It's fairly, it's the cultural side of their brain, basically, kicking in order to learn how to do things. And this question, basically what he said is, they were planning on raising the woolly mammoths, or whatever these things are going to be, with existing elephants. Now, there are certain things, I didn't have time to get to this. I would have asked, okay, but you're specifically engineering these things so they can be cold tolerant. Are you going to take existing ones that couldn't handle the Siberian climate and move them there? Because if so, how would that work? How are you going to do that? I would be very curious to hear the specifics of how they're planning on handling that. Because in other words, if they're engineering a species, re-engineering the species to live in the coldest of climates in the Arctic that they alone can handle.
Who's going to raise them?
Yeah, who's going to raise them? And are you going to plan to, transplant an Indian elephant, an Asian elephant when they're much further south and in a much more tropical climb, so to speak? I don't see that working. But that's broadly the approach, is they're planning on doing the bonding thing with existing elephants.
Yeah.
That could go wrong in a bunch of ways, clearly also. You don't necessarily know how the woolly mammoths acted, and they could learn drastically different behaviors and not actually effectively pair bond potentially with their quote-unquote parents or with these other elephants, depending on how that goes. Or it could go well. I don't know. This is something that, assuming this all rolls forward, which is, of course, itself a big question, we'll see.
I suspect they would probably take on the behavior of the parents. I mean, I don't think they would have anything else to kind of go by. Like, think of not cows, like horses. Or not horses is the wrong word for it. It's the wrong one. Like pigs that are raised around dogs. And the pigs are acting like a dog, that type of stuff. Where the pig is like, okay, well, I guess I'm supposed to be like that. They're going to have certain behaviors and attributes associated with their, just because of what they are. So that's totally fair.
Yeah.
But when you get to this kind of these other behaviors, I get the feeling that it's probably just going to be replicating whatever they see around them more than them having this kind of ingrained, inherited bias towards X or Y. The bias might be there, but I don't know how prolific that's going to be in the context of whatever they're around.
How well that's going to take root in their environment in terms of their actions.
Yeah. And like you said, the other one is, okay, you can't take an elephant that's been living in the Sahara, and I know elephants don't live in the Sahara, but I'm saying in a hot climate, and put it in the middle of the Arctic. You're basically just going to kill that elephant. And so I don't know. I mean, it could be a situation where they actually bring it into a warmer climate and then transplant it later. Maybe that's ideal. Because otherwise, the bonding thing seems like it would be a big deal.
Yeah.
What is going to birth that thing?
Totally.
And at the point where unless they birth it in one particular place and then you just take it, but at that point, you're taking it by itself. So I don't know, unless you make both of, it seems like the only way that works is if you do several at once. It can't just be one.
No.
It's almost like you have to build a community.
They're planning on doing herds. It seems like they're wanting to do, and there's another section where they were talking about herds, basically. And they're thinking of creating, you can think of a wheel, but without the rim on it. Basically, you have the hub and then the spokes radiating out from the wheel.
Yeah.
They're talking about trying to create pathways way out in the wilderness, of course, but basically ways that the woolly mammoths could go from a sort of central location out in these different directions, like radiating out from the hub to the spokes, basically.
Yeah.
They were talking about numbers. They were saying that they could theoretically cover 1 million square miles, 1,000 by 1 million square kilometers, 1,000 by 1,000 kilometers, basically, effectively, in the range of hundreds of woolly mammoths. So, not a huge population.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't match the earlier levels, but it would be a pretty darn big start. And they're big creatures.
Yeah.
And part of what they do is they go through forests, they uproot trees, they significantly change the local ecosystem. They mess things up, so to speak. But in its own way, that's good. You're sort of ruffling this thing up and creating these prairie spaces, these prairie walkways that then a lot of other animals would theoretically come in and use. You're adding a little bit more diversity. You're basically taking what would be heavily forested tundra and replacing stretches of it with prairie land running through it. Not prairie is not exactly right, but like deforested sections that other animals can then use. Ideally adding biodiversity and that kind of thing. Although who knows how much of that would be genetically re-engineered. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans.
Wait, real quick. Did they talk about any consequences, like consequences or unforeseen consequences? Like, I don't know. It's like this thing has a disease that we weren't necessarily accustomed to, and it killed the elephant population. And
they did get into that. And that was actually what I was about to get to next.
Oh, okay.
But Tarif is calling, and we said we were taking calls. Tarif, here's the thing, though, man. We're planning on talking about this, and we only have so much time. If you're calling in about this, please feel free. But if you're calling about general stuff, I'm just going to ask that you call in later.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. I think you're calling back then. But Tarif, thank you for the call. Looking forward to hearing from you later if you're still around. And thank you for the call again. But Jamarl, you were just asking about vaccines and viruses. That whole
viruses in general. Like if
if
there's a virus that's a killer, or even if I don't know, just some unforeseen consequence in the bringing these things back that we never really had to deal with as human beings just because they weren't necessarily around.
Yes. That's something that came up. Yeah, one of the women who was in on the conversation asked about that. And she had asked it in a slightly jumbled way, but basically I think what she was asking, what they ultimately responded to was, are you going to resurrect any ancient viruses accidentally by bringing these things back? And their answer, they sort of answered another question and then also answered that one because they figured that's what she was actually asking. But she had the way that she had asked it had sounded like, what analysis are you doing of the ancient viruses they would have in their system or something like that? Mm-hmm. And what they're doing is they can see viruses in the DNA that they're looking at. And they have been stripping those out. And it's a weird thing to think about. But that's what they're saying, is that they've been looking at the DNA effectively. I'm an extreme newbie. This is going to be oversimplified up the wazoo, so please, God, forgive me. But they have been stripping out the viruses from the DNA that they're looking at. They've been trying to do that with currently living animals before they're born to make sure that it works, basically, and apparently it's been working.
Yeah.
And they're planning on doing that because some of the species of elephants that they're planning on bringing it from, I think there's like a kind of herpes that kills like 20%, 25% or so of a specific kind of elephant. And so, if they're wanting to crossbreed it, they don't want that to be a sort of huge threat in the population that they're creating.
That's right.
And so they're pre-doing that. And where my mind went, and we unfortunately, I don't think got to, was like, okay, so you guys are doing a lot of stuff here. You're stripping viruses out of animals that you're bringing back from life into new and larger in vitro setups. Like
the order of complication gets higher and higher and higher all the way through. Yeah.
But then also it's like, in the same way that when you tax a muscle group and exercise, it tends to grow. That's kind of how this kind of thing goes in science. If you're facing a serious engineering problem, you often make new scientific discoveries as you try to do that stuff. So I was going to be like, what realms of scientific discovery do you see coming up? Unfortunately, we didn't get to it. And again, there's only so much you can know that stuff before it happens. You don't know what you're going to discover before you discover it to some extent.
You almost have to do it.
Yeah.
And research it after you do it.
100%.
But at that point, the order of magnitude of wow, that's slightly disconcerting. Because it's you basically have to trust that they nail it. As somebody who's did software, even software programs, they're nowhere near as complicated as, let's say, the human body or just life in general and that stuff. And we get it wrong all the time. The best of us gets it wrong in trying to analyze software, analyze code. And these guys are not just looking at old stuff and saying, okay, we're doing this and that. Like you said, it's an order of magnitude of difficulty as, okay, we're going to bring this thing back from extinction, basically, play God. And on top of that, we're going to go through its genetic code or its DNA or whatever else, and we're going to rip out viruses that may be potentially harmful to our species and to the species of whatever else, plant life or whatever animal life that it's going to be in. And again, we don't even know if that stuff can jump human and how it affects the human body and all that stuff. And we have to trust that they nail it. Now, an argument can be made, that's always the case. When they were doing nuclear weapons tests, they thought the nuclear weapons tests may singe the atmosphere and burn, destroy the earth.
Yep.
Or when they were doing the particle reactors, they thought they may create a miniature black hole that destroys, So all of that stuff becomes, concerns and everything else. But this is one of those things that clearly is a concern since they're stripping it out. Like, it's not just, okay, you guys are, being hyperbolic in your concern. Well, it's like, no, you're actively stripping out viruses in order to prevent those things from coming to fruition. So, I don't know. It's interesting, though.
It is.
It wouldn't stop me from doing it.
That's the thing. And for a lot of people, I'm guessing it's people who were nerds when they were young and were like, dude, it'd be cool if there were like dinosaurs and saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths and all these things in our world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And on that level, I can't slide them, but also, should that be the justification? I don't know. Don't want to read too much into it. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That strongly implies that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the news. In the news, yesterday in the United States, there were 116,090 new COVID cases reported, along with 2,744 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 111,210 cases per day, still a decrease of 26% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and now 65% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,458,265 people across the United States and has killed 697,988 men, women, and children. Before we get to next week, we would have hit the 700,000 mark. Merck and Company, or Merck & Co., has stated that its experimental COVID-19 pill reduced hospitalizations and deaths by half in people recently infected with the coronavirus, and they will soon ask health officials in the United States around the world to authorize its use. Of patients taking the medication molnupiravir, 7.1% were either hospitalized or died at the end of the 30 days compared to 14.1% who were given the placebo pill. In national news, we have a government today. Woohoo! We weren't necessarily sure if we were going to have it. However, they were able to pass the bill, the spending bill, funding bill, at least for the next 2 months. With only hours to spare, President Biden signed legislation that would avoid a government shutdown and keep it funded through December the 3rd. A new study by The Lancet has found that more than half of police killings in the United States are not reported in official government data, as well as Black Americans being most likely to experience fatal police violence. An estimated 55% of deaths from police violence in 1980 to 2018 were misclassified or unreported in official vital statistics reports. This would mean that about 17,100 deaths underreported during this period during this 40-year period. And again, as I've noted before, police killed at least 1,000 people a year, with only 1% of those cops being prosecuted. And now we're learning that the deaths are far higher than that. Governor Gavin Newsom has authorized the return of California property to descendants of a Black couple who were run out of Manhattan Beach almost a century ago, giving reparation advocates a hope for achieving their goals in California. Kosovo and Serbia have come to a brokered deal on a border conflict that brought up old tensions after Kosovo last week sent special police to the border to remove Serbia license plates for cars entering the country. They also basically was forcing people to put on the Kosovo license plate, or the Republic of Kosovo, which was basically a humiliation for Serbia. Protesting that rule, local Serbians blocked the border with their trucks. Near Afghanistan's second largest city, the Kandahar Province Central General Prison is currently populated by hundreds of men, most of whom are drug addicts swept from the streets of the city. Only 10% of the approximately 700 people in the prison are criminals, with the rest being drug addicts. A new study has warned that China's population could halve within the next 45 years. This comes after years of trying to control the amount of children families have. Well, it worked. It worked too well. The current birth rate was 1.3 children for each woman, well below the level needed to stop the population from declining. In Earth and Science news, the FAA will be looking into Jeff Bezos' company Blue Origins, as multiple former employees have come out saying the company regularly engages in unsafe practices involving federal export control regulation. Let's keep going. We have several holidays for today. Actually, before we get to the several holidays, there's another story that I thought is uber weird. This has to do with the Great Spot. Rick Sanchez mentioned this, and I just thought this was very cool. The Great Red Spot, this is Cosmos article. The Great Red Spot on Jupiter, the vast storm that basically has been raging for 150 years, it seems that the wind speeds are changing and scientists don't necessarily know why. The storm is an anticyclone big enough to swallow the entire planet Earth, with massive crimson-colored clouds spinning in anti-clockwise direction. The winds raging on the outer edge are more than twice as intense as a Category 5 cyclone here on Earth, while the winds within the storm are cruising around more slowly. A new study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research has found that the outer wind speeds have picked up. Using data from Hubble Space Telescope from 2009 to 2020, research team found that mean wind speeds in the Great Red Spot have increased by 4 to 8%. This correlates to wind speeds by only 2.5 kilometer per hour Earth year, so now they blow at more than 640 kilometers per hour. Wow. And again, it is hard to fathom a storm so big that Earth would basically be swallowed up in the storm. I think it was like 10,000 miles wide or something like that. It's insane measurements. Let's get to holidays for today. Today, Chinese national holiday, International Day of Older Persons. That's an interesting one. National Fire Pup Day. I have no idea what that one is. National Homemade Cookies Day, and National Lace Day. I'm beginning to think that people have too much time on their hands making some of these days. However, those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fire Pup Day, by the way, is celebrating the dogs that work in fire departments.
Interesting.
That is what that is, the canine unit at the fire department.
Because it says Fire Pup, and it's like, okay, Fire Pup, but now that makes sense. Yes. Fire Department Pups Day.
Exactly.
Very cool. And International Day of Older Persons. They don't have a cooler name than that. For some reason, I feel like they could do a better job naming that one. There's one more that I kind of want to hit.
That's terrible. International Day of Older Persons. Austin, I'm sure Cuomo is celebrating this.
Why is Cuomo celebrating?
Because of the nursing home.
That's
a dark humor. Okay.
Killing of those grandmas. Yeah, and then hiding the bodies. Yeah, that's grim. That's pretty grim.
Good.
There's one more. So the Kidney Project successfully tested the prototype bio-artificial kidney. Now, they always, anytime, they're talking about artificial organs and everything else, it's always 20 years in advance. It's always 20 years in advance. Anytime you find, there's like, in 20 years we'll have X or Y. Well, it seems that they're making progress on this. This came out September 9th. And basically, in the last few years, the Kidney Project successfully tested the hemofilter, which removes waste products and toxins from the blood, and a bioreactor, which replicates other kidney functions like balancing of electrolytes in the blood, and separate experiments. Your kidney does a lot of weird stuff. Your body doesn't just... When we build code and programs, we tend to build those things to be very specific to a very particular task, meaning I do one thing as a function. And oftentimes you will build classes and everything else to kind of mimic human or let's say behaviors of life, things of objects and so forth. Well, nature doesn't necessarily do that. And so your kidney would control, your blood pressure. It would control calcium, phosphorus metabolism. It would control the amount of potassium you have in your body. It controls even things like, things that are unrelated necessarily to kidneys. It is very, very intricate in what it does. And so any device that they're going to have to build would have to be able to accommodate all of that stuff. And they apparently have a device that hits many of those numbers. In fact, it's even so good. I was about to curse for a moment, but it's even so good. It manages to do this using the person's own blood pressure. Meaning you don't necessarily need to put a battery or anything else in it. The blood pressure of the person basically powers the device. So this will be phenomenal. If you think of the number of people who are waiting for transplants, if you think of the number of people who are in kidney failure, and as far as I can tell, rejection is not necessarily an issue associated with it. And so this will be phenomenal. I mean, they've had the heart, the artificial hearts that they've been working on and everything else. And those people basically suffered there with that thing beating in their chest. Have you ever seen this? Where they put the artificial heart in, the guy lives painfully for like a few days or whatever else.
Oh, that's not bad.
It's a rough, it looks
sounds
rough.
like a rough way to die.
It is a rough way to go for science.
The stuff of which our nightmares are made.
Yes. But, it's like one of those things where ideally you would think it would get better and better and more progress and everything else. But for something like this, the kidney is not necessarily the heart. And in this case, it seems that they're finding, they're making progress. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, that is a good thing.
Yeah, that is very good.
Would you get one?
Yes, in a heartbeat.
Because
I've had
kidney pump.
Well, I've had 2 rejections. So I've had 2 transplants. The first one lasted, I think it was like 6 or 7 months, and I think it was like 19. And the second one lasted maybe 4 years. And so both had to be pulled out because they continued to reject after the fact.
Yeah.
And so the first one was painful. It wouldn't, the pain wouldn't necessarily subside. And they eventually had to basically take it out the moment that it failed. The second one, weirdly enough, was basically dead for like 9 years. All of a sudden, out of the blue, starts to reject. And it was like, what? And the doctor's like, yeah, I don't know what that's about, but we got to take that out.
Oof.
And so, taking it out is not bad. I mean, it's like changing a muffler. It's putting it in is far easier than taking it out, though. Taking it out is far more painful than putting one in. But all things being equal, the rejection thing is not necessarily part of this particular process. And so, I don't know. I would say it's great progress. And, if you think of the amount of money that people have to pay, the amount of money that the government pays, I mean, the treatments that people typically have to get, meaning routine dialysis and everything else, the government pays a large share of that. So those people are able to get Medicare where the government would have to take on part of the cost. Well, I mean, this goes on for decades, though. It's not like the person dies overnight. The person goes on for years. And that's an expense that basically has to be covered over and over and over again. Well, if you have a situation where you can put in a device where you can mitigate the need for dialysis or have dialysis to be used for people who are, for whatever particular reason, can't use the device or don't necessarily want to use it, well, you can limit the number of people who would have to deal with that issue. And so this would be a great stride and a great progress. So
it sounds like it. The part that I keep getting my head stuck on the part where they're charging the device from your blood pressure, from your blood flow.
So I don't know if they're charging. It might be. Let me see.
They're
basically, somehow they're powering the device.
I just would worry about clotting. That's kind of what I get curious about. Or if it's like harvesting electrons from your blood somehow. Like talk about an energy vampire.
Well, it's probably
literally
using your blood pressure as a way of maneuvering it, like power.
Well, it's a hydraulic pump. No,
it might be like a pump.
I get that idea, but then I would worry about clotting. I'd worry that you'd get...
clotting is always an issue.
That's exactly. And that sounds like it would exacerbate it. If you're having to use your blood to power a device with hydraulics, basically, like you can think of a water turbine or, a water mill inside of your blood vessel. Yeah, a turbine like that. I would just worry that would, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But they would undoubtedly have figured this stuff out.
The person's probably going to be on some kind of blood thinners or something like that in order to prevent the clotting. Or the materials themselves might be made out of something that prevents the, I'm always more so worried about whatever they're using in the materials that they're just putting in the body. In general.
And it's going to leach, that kind of thing or something like that?
But, at this point, they have pacemakers. They have the things that they put in people's heads, in order to deal with it. Even fistulas and grafts, those things are like fabric that they put into the person's body for whatever.
I'm going to take this conversation truly somewhere weird. Say they keep going with this for a little while, and they start making better and better ones. And pretty soon you've got one that's like on
better than the regular kidney?
Or works better than a kidney. It's like a little bit lighter and smaller and sleeker. And it makes you more aerodynamic and technically lighter. And suddenly somebody wants to have their kidney removed and replaced with it.
And you can process bleach. You can just process weird stuff.
You can take any medical advice you want to from any sitting president. You can inject Clorox directly into your veins. No, I'm kidding. But
it's like, look, this gets into the transhumanist stuff, right? Like the uber sci-fi stuff where we've improved upon God.
Well, we were talking about resurrecting woolly mammoths a couple of minutes ago. We're in that world already. I figure why not prepare for the inevitable here?
Well, look, at the point where they're building something that can do this, it's only going to get better. What does this look like in 100 years? That could be pretty significant. If we weren't spending $750 billion a year on blowing stuff up and killing people, and not just us, let's say China and Russia and all of these other countries around the globe, we're spending so much money and so many resources on just killing each other. What would that look like if that money was being dedicated towards advancement, science, society, research?
I like that.
Stuff.
I like that. I try to bring it up for the ethical dilemma, but you're like, we should just fund it, man. You skip right past the conversation.
I am a sucker for scientific advancement on this stuff. No, I'm fascinated by this stuff. Because to me, it's the issue of progress. Like, what is the point of life? And, of all of the things, we have this reality space to which we can operate, we can maneuver, we can make choices, and we have this kind of, whatever those decision spaces are, that stuff gets instantiated in this kind of reality that perpetuates itself forward. And we have all sorts of technological capability and intelligence in order to do some amazing things. And those amazing things get put to blowing stuff up as opposed to stuff like this.
Well, what about if how this starts is the military, again, instead of cutting down their funding, what if the military, IARPA or DARPA together, something like that, start putting artificial kidneys into soldiers, that kind of thing. I mean, if it gets to that point, I mean, there have been experiments over the decades looking at creating super soldiers, whether it's through pharmaceutical drugs or this kind of thing wouldn't surprise me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's
that's
like
where it gets.
This person's going into a war zone and they need to have a body that can accommodate all of these chemical substances to keep them moving forward so they can, inhale. Well, I keep saying bleach, but you know what I mean. Honestly, you can kind of see where something like that would go, where the organ itself or the biological or the manufactured organ is just as good, if not better in some respects, than the one that is already there, basically improving upon nature. It's fascinating when you think about it. What is it? What is that movie? Repo Man, where they had these kind of organic, devices that they were making and they were putting in people, but in Repo, they were taking it out after if you couldn't pay for it. It's like if you can't pay for it, the guy will come to your house.
We're thinking of a different Repo Man.
Oh, yeah.
I was thinking of the 1984 black comedy punk film, which is different. Also sci-fi in its own weird way, but a different Repo Man.
But no, I just thought it was a great story, man.
You're thinking of the 2010 science fiction action film, Repo Man.
With the British cat.
Jude Law.
Jude Law.
There you go.
Yeah. But no, but in their cases, they were basically building organs and then putting those organs, hearts, livers, kidneys, eyes, the works. I mean, pretty much everything that the body can make. And they would upgrading those items, beyond the regular body.
As time goes on. And then you combine that with Gattaca, and all of a sudden you have clones and genetic engineered clones, and then implants, and that is the true post-human, transhuman future, whatever. Not technically, that's not post-human.
But you can see it. I mean, that's the wild part. Like, it's not so far away where you can't look at it and be like, yeah, I can't see that happening. I mean, no, you can see science progressing in a particular way when we get like more materials. The materials get somewhat different. You may even have materials that don't necessarily react with the body in a particular way. So rejection, or for that matter, even a clotting issue may not be on point.
I'm open to these questions, and not being that way. I've just been letting all this stuff slide, but I do feel the need to come in with the devil's advocate position, which is, dude, we're suddenly really deep into a lot of deep ethical changes about like how humanity works and what our society's supposed to look like and what things we're supposed to tolerate. Because if we don't restrict ourselves to matters of pure health, there's also like, okay, so are people going to speciate into different species? Are we going to are people going to genetically engineer themselves so that there's no longer a humanity as such?
Like adding wolf DNA for soldiers to make them more aggressive,
that kind of thing. Or just even people, would do designer fashion. Maybe we'll do designer genetics at some point where people will, again, literally try to branch themselves off. I'm just pushing the territories because that feels pretty weird for people to be doing.
From where we are, it seems weird.
All of it seems weird, but once you get into that territory, or changing your physical aesthetics, so that instead of looking like a normal person, you either look dramatic, the most beautiful, handsome, whatever person in the world, or you don't look human at all. You technically are human, but and people already try to do that stuff with tattoos and piercings and things and succeed at it quite.
But what does it look like when you take it to a genetic level?
Yeah, exactly. There are all these different questions, and
should a person not be able to do that?
Well, that's where the other side of the question comes in, is the libertarian asking, well, who are you to stop me if I want to do my research? I don't know, man. People have killed people for less than that. That's the kind of thing that I'm worried about in some way. But also, I don't know, man. The whole thing is complicated. You know what I mean? We've had Salem witch trials, and all of a sudden somebody's trying to become a biomechanical dragon. I could see that. I could see people not wanting to accept that. It's just the facts on the ground.
Yeah, a biomechanical dragon. I love that. I don't know. In my head, there is no should, or there's no necessarily shouldn't. Society doesn't necessarily have it needs to look X or Y. I mean, it depends on whether or not it's consistent within itself. Meaning it has to be logically consistent in a way that can perpetuate itself. And there's some eventualities that may not be able to do that.
Yes.
Like if you're living in a world where you are burning fossil fuels constantly, you don't necessarily have any restraint on it. Well, that kills your planet. So it doesn't matter. The should in that case is, if you believe that reality or our planet should persist itself, then this is a wrong way of going. It's that stuff. That's where the shoulds come into me. But from the standpoint of like some kind of God perspective of should it be this way or that way, short of it being consistent within itself where it can perpetuate itself. I don't know if that exists.
I want to cap it because we've got Mark on the line. My brief closing comment on this is where I fall is as long as we have freedom to explore and there's no oppressive top-down structure that tells me I have to live that way and I'm not captured by that system's incentives where I have to adapt, where I can just leave. I can just go off. And frankly, that means space travel at a certain point because we're talking about science fiction. But of course, that's another topic. Mark Slavoda on the line. And if he's listening before he comes on, he's probably confused and hopefully not terrified. Maybe even excited. I don't know. Mark, we were having a conversation about woolly mammoths on the other side of the break. We're going into our break now. We will be coming back with Mark Slavoda, international relations and security analyst, talking about negotiations between Turkey and Russia, negotiations between Russia and the United States, the North Korean missile test, and this conflict at the Serbian-Kosovo border. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So let's go to the meeting. It seems that there's been right much negotiation that has been taking place around the world. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Let's start with Russia's and Turkey's meeting. You had Putin and Erdogan holding talks over Syria. Basically, Turkey is still in Syria, and there is this concern about, if I'm not mistaken, Idlib province, basically northern Syria, and this Turkish influence in northern Syria. This is the area where the last bastion of terrorism is residing, and they are having this negotiation on what to do about the issue in the country. To have a conversation, we're joined with Mark Slavoda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Jamarl, Shane, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you. As I was reading the story, I always thought the story was so odd. Basically, Turkey, Erdogan is in somebody else's territory, basically Syria. And Syria is not necessarily in a position, militarily or otherwise, after basically like a decade of war, of doing anything about it. Russia has been this kind of guarantor, more or less, of Syrian independence and is in negotiations with Erdogan. Now, these negotiations have led to, I guess, weapons, the S-400s, but they've even seemed to have expanded those negotiations into military, not just hardware, but, some of the heavier military equipment like ships and planes and whatnot. What is going on within these negotiations? And what is the goal of Erdogan in Syria at this point? And what does Russia want out of this negotiation?
Yeah, actually, Syria is still insanely complicated at this point because there are actually three foreign powers involved in a three-way Mexican standoff, because there is the Syrian government in Damascus, supported by Russia, the UN-recognized government. There is the United States still illegally militarily occupying East Syria, with their proxy Kurdish regime there. And then there is Turkey, which is camped out in North Syria, almost along the entire length of the country. There is a zone of Turkish military occupation by their Sunni and their Sunni Islamist proxies, which they have kind of coalesced most of the jihadi groups into one military formation that they now call the Syrian National Army. And then there is Idlib province. And Idlib province, about half of it, the northern area of it, is still controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is Al Qaeda. It's the local affiliate of Al Qaeda, and even the United States recognizes that HTS is just Al Qaeda, and they are backed by Turkey. And Turkey had agreed to fight, to recognize them as terrorists and to fight them. And instead, they've done pretty much exactly the opposite. And there are some 84 Turkish strongholds and military bases in Idlib, and more than 10,000 troops. We're going up into tens of thousands of Turkish troops supporting Al Qaeda there. And making sure they continue to control Idlib. And Turkey's grand plan, of course, Erdogan tends towards neo-Ottomanism, a belief in a greater Turkey. He thinks that this territory is rightly Turkey's, and was unfairly given up in previous times. And what he has done is essentially ethnically cleanse all of that northern Syria border, as much as he has so far, of the Kurdish population. And a significant part of it has already fled. And he is repopulating it with Sunni Islamists from the rest of Syria that have been involved in the civil conflict there, that regard him as their, ally, patron, protector. And he has basically set up a de facto partition state in northern Syria that is under his control. And Idlib is like an addendum on to that.
So just briefly, I want to get into what you think came out of this meeting. Not that we know necessarily, but I'm trying to rely on you to say, realistically, what practically happened. Erdogan and Biden at the UNGA didn't meet, not even, not publicly. They just didn't meet at all. That was a bit of a diplomatic imbroglio there for a second. And Erdogan also said, he kind of reiterated, they were planning on purchasing more S-400s, a second round of the S-400 missile defense system, which, of course, they would be purchasing from Russia as they did the first, and which was its own big dispute between the United States and Russia, with the U.S. freaking out about the sale there. And they're doing the same thing a second time, where they'd be sanctioning them under CATSA. That's the threat here if they go through and do that. So that's that backdrop in terms of how Erdogan is feeling about the United States right now. Going into this meeting with Putin, they're at, in a dispute, clearly. They're on the opposite sides of the table here, but they have come to that table and they're now talking over it. What do you think happened in this meeting, Mark?
Okay, so actually, Erdogan spoke to the press after his non-meeting on the sidelines of the UNGA with Biden about how he didn't get what he wanted, and it's really his relationship with the U.S., and said, well, maybe I'll align Turkey with Russia instead. So he made a clear indication of there. And to give you a short history, Turkey under Erdogan has long played this game of trying to playing Russia and the U.S. off each other for his own geopolitical advantage, and has been quite successful out of it because of the importance of Turkey geopolitically for both countries. For the U.S., it allows military basing and power projection into the Middle East, and also keeps Turkey to the south of Russia firmly, in the NATO camp. It's a NATO member. For Russia, it's strategically important because Turkey controls the Dardanelles Straits from the access of the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. So it's has very important historically for Russia for trade and for military naval purposes. So hugely important geopolitically for both countries. And Turkey and Russia are now militarily at odds in Syria, where they have actually been in direct conflict with each other, in Libya, where they're on different sides of a proxy war. They have essentially been on different sides of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict at some level, though Russia tried to play an above the board and actually brokered the ceasefire agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Erdogan has been actively militarily backing Azerbaijan in recovering territory from Armenia. And Erdogan has also now been selling drones. It has become a big drone manufacturer. I know that's a big surprise. And has been selling combat drones, which it has tested in Libya and in Azerbaijan, to Ukraine and to Poland, who are regarded as, potential strategic adversaries of Russia. So Erdogan is all up in Russia's business geopolitically, but they have agreed, despite their geopolitical differences and conflicts, to actually engage actively in trade. And they are multiple. Russia sells Turkey most of its natural gas, and they've just completed Turkstream through Turkey to deliver gas not just to Turkey, but then on to Europe. And a deal was just signed there with Hungary. So this is kind of like a lesser-known pipeline that was also sanctioned by the United States to try to stop it. Erdogan paid no mind either. And this will deliver gas to southern Europe, like Nord Stream to the north of Europe with Germany. Russia is building Turkey nuclear power plants. Russia helped Turkey put out massive wildfires this summer. Russian tourism is essential to keeping the failing Turkish economy afloat. Large numbers of tourists in Turkish resorts. Turkish produce, tomatoes, lots of other produce are, it's a big sale for them to sell into Russia. So there's huge economic ties that Russia has exerted great leverage over Turkey. But this meeting was preceded by massive military buildup on both sides in Idlib, with Russia massively increasing their airstrikes, particularly in West Idlib, where there are some al-Qaeda allies. These are Uyghurs from China, Western China and Central Asia, the Turkestan Islamic Party, and Russia was airstriking them pretty heavily in the run-up to this meeting. So tensions were high and still are pretty high. And because the meeting was held behind closed doors, we don't know yet if they agreed to anything in Idlib, particularly which will reduce those tensions and lead to, a return to frozen conflict or a continuation of the frozen conflict that is going on there, rather than a return to open hostilities. And at the same time, they almost certainly discussed Libya, Afghanistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, a whole host of subjects that both countries have interest in and are geopolitically at odds. I like to think of it this way. Putin and Erdogan, imagine them waltzing together hand in hand across a chessboard with smiles on their faces and daggers poised at each other's back. Yeah. And that sums up the Turkish-Russian geopolitical relationship pretty well.
It's a beautiful image. Yeah. It's a weird sense of frenemies. Yeah, I love the image, as Shane said. What does Putin want out of this? I mean, so I get that we don't necessarily know what they've agreed upon, if anything was agreed upon at all. But like you said, there's a host of issues, everything from economic to military, geopolitical, and everything in between. What does Russia want out of this negotiation, or want out of these issues that are taking place? Meaning, why is Russia on the other side of these talks?
Well, for one, Russia is engaged in a continual game to try to ease Turkey out of northern Syria, to make them recognize that it's not to their advantage to be there, and to leave without a direct conflict erupting between Russia and Turkey. That is a long, ongoing discussion, occasionally punctuated by fighting. Other than that, they also did sign some Russian-Turkish military technical deals where Russia and Turkey will work on joint development of jet engines, naval ships, and possibly also submarines as well, which will basically be Russia showing Turkey how to do it, with some Turkish investment and possibly local production.
All right, I want to turn now to another related set of negotiations ongoing that between Russia and the United States. What's happening here, Mark?
So we've just had a second round of strategic talks that are the two sides have agreed to after they agreed to renew the last of the Cold War era nuclear security architectures, the New START Treaty. They agreed to continue talking. These are wide-ranging, considering nuclear issues, but also considering branching off into new weapon developments like hypersonics. Russia wants to include missile defense, of course. They always have. The U.S. refuses to budge on that issue. It also includes artificial intelligence, cyber warfare and cyber crime, space, artificial intelligence. These are all what countries are thinking in this new world of modern military and technological developments of what strategically they have to negotiate on. And so far, there's no real progress on anything in big strategic terms, nor is there likely to be, other than the fact that the two countries are talking to each other once again on a serious platform rather than screaming, yelling, social mediaing at each other like they were during much of the Trump years. So that's somewhat of an improvement. They are unlikely to because the U.S. refuses to include missile defense. They pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, defense treaty in the early 2000s unilaterally, and Russia developed a whole host of new weapons as an asymmetric response, hypersonics, hypersonic glide vehicles, etc., in order to preserve their strategic deterrent, as they saw it, mutually assured destruction, to make sure that they could get past missile defense. The U.S. still doesn't have any intention of including missile defense in talks. On the other side, the U.S. is not really interested in cutting any unilateral deal with Russia that would tie its hands with China. Because it's viewing that it's coming naval conflict with China in the West Pacific. It won't cut any deal with Russia that doesn't include China. So those talks are really going nowhere because Russia can't force and has no intention of bringing China in. But the small progress they have made is they've agreed to talk each other and to at least share some information on cyber crime, which they haven't been doing since 2014. That is the modest agreement they've come to. But you have to remember that since these talks have begun, the two countries, the U.S. continues to launch new sanctions against Russia. The Biden administration continues these provocative military patrols under the euphemism of freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea, in the Russian Far East, wherever Russia has maritime borders. And they view this, of course, as constant military pressure to contain Russia.
Yeah, it's basically a provocation. Also,
yes,
there's a lot of weirdness with this position, I guess. I mean, from the standpoint of putting sanctions on sovereign nations when they don't buy U.S. equipment, that's bizarre in and of itself, meaning basically threatening Erdogan or threatening India that if you buy that other product, we're going to pass sanctions on you, basically using military as a way to prevent other countries from buying products that aren't from us. It's just very strange in and of itself. It's a breach of sovereignty.
Yeah, if you buy gas from Russia, build a pipeline, not from our more expensive LNG, then we will sanction you.
Yeah, it's very bizarre.
If you try to kill a pipeline, if you try to buy military equipment from Russia, we will sanction you. It's economic warfare.
It is. This other angle also, where the United States wants to bring China into the negotiation. Well, the U.S. and Russia has 90% of the nuclear weapons across the world. And if they're going to bring in China, I would imagine China has every right, if they're going to be a part of the conversation, to say, well, what about AUKUS? What about the Quad?
What about UK? What about France?
Exactly.
the UK has more nuclear weapons at the moment France does than China does. What about India, Pakistan? What about Israel? You know, the one that everyone knows has nuclear weapons and never admits it. You know, that's there's the whole host there. If we bring them in, and China has only a tiny fraction of the nuclear weapons that the U.S. Or Russia does. So at the moment, but the U.S. is afraid of them building more, and this is why the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which also limits conventional missiles of short and intermediate range as well, because not because of any allegations of Russian violations, but because they wanted to put short and intermediate range conventional missiles, possibly nuclear as well, in the West Pacific on island chains in Japan and elsewhere, because they viewed that there was a conventional missile gap between them and China in what they view as an inevitable naval conflict in the West Pacific, in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits with China.
How about we move slightly further north now to North Korea, which last night I saw, it wouldn't be last night their time, it would be the morning, continued missile launch tests. This was the second time this week, and they've been doing it a bunch recently. Now, some of these missiles are hypersonic, and they've been pushing the range. This escalation, well, first of all, if you care to go into the specific military hardware they're testing out here and how much of an advance that is, but also it seems like there's been a lot of it recently. What do you think that forebodes, if anything, Mark?
Yeah, supposedly, according to North Korean reports, and I have not seen a Russian or U.S. official assessment of that, they say that they have tested a hypersonic glide vehicle, which of course would be a significant advance in missile tech to deliver. But they have also made an improvements on the shift from liquid to solid fuels, whereby they will be able to deliver and fire their existing missile fleet much better. And much longer range and much faster. So that is, if anything, even more significant a development. But North Korea continues on the lack of any progress in U.S.-North Korea negotiations. The U.S. continues to deny the principal North Korean demand. We want a permanent end to the war, because the U.S. and North Korea are still technically at war. There's only an armistice agreement, and we want you to, we want guarantees that you recognize our existence, our sovereignty, and that you won't attack us and stop these provocative military drills with South Korea on our border, because we have a really bad memory of the U.S. bombing campaign in the Korean War, that they basically leveled our country almost to the Stone Age and killed lots and lots and lots of people. That is still North Korea's principal demand is they want peace. They want the technical peace, and they want real peace. And the U.S. has no intention of giving it to them, because it values geopolitically its ability to keep, massive amount of U.S. troops in South Korea as a hedge against China.
Well, that's the interesting part. I mean, if I remember correctly, we killed 20% of their population in that war, which, the kicker is we always call it the forgotten war. They're not going to forget at all, considering the damage that was done. I get that the United States wants its troops there, and I do want to get to Kosovo and Serbia before we close. But what is South Korea's incentive to keep those troops there? Meaning, I get that the United States wants this kind of geopolitical, the positioning of having a huge number of troops in a particular area to be able to move and maneuver for, it allows a certain amount of clout in the region. But from South Korea's standpoint, it seemed that South Korea and North Korea actually did want some level of peace, some level of reunification, if not reunification, definitely a removal of the hostilities between the two nations. What is the thing that stops South Korea from doing this? And what is their incentive to not get closer? Or is it purely just the United States being this kind of stick-to-itive to being there? That's the issue.
Yeah, it's complicated is short term. You have to remember that modern South Korea emerged out of a nationalist regime that the U.S. supported there, and have only very lately become what we can, in any real means, call a democracy. They have a military and political establishment that has basically been, raised by the U.S. and feels, very obliged to the U.S. And has no intention of doing anything without U.S. approval. That said, their current leader, Moon Jae-in, has made much stronger efforts towards real peace with North Korea and the eventual possibility of reunification of Korea, oftentimes at odds with U.S. Geopolitical wishes. And they've been trying to continue that process as much as they can, I think. But basically, every time South Korea conducts another military war game on North Korea's border, military exercises, North Korea backs a little bit further out of negotiations, and the U.S. keeps insisting on these military drills. And there is a part of the South Korean political and military establishment that has, views it through the U.S. Geopolitical prism, and Moon Jae-in doesn't have, complete control of his own country. But we've seen fits and starts in the relationship between South Korea and North Korea, but better prospects than there has been, since the 1950s.
Any comment too? Just while we're talking about it, Kim Yo-jong, her rise, which is I'm seeing it in the news a bunch recently, of course, pointed to a new position, but also she had, she's gone through these waves of popularity. Do you take that as a geopolitical event, or do you see that simply as local celebrity? Do you see that as, internal politics, choosing the heir apparent, that kind of thing? How do you see that move, Mark?
Yeah, that's purely inner North Korean politics, which is, of course, this weird combination of this huge communism and a dynasty family. So this is more family and internal politics than anything else.
Makes sense.
There is no certain that she is a formidable leader, and in this, a lieutenant of Kim Jong-un in any right, and certainly positioned if something were to happen to him, or if there's some type of internal power struggle, to possibly rise to some higher leadership position.
Yeah, yes. You know what, Mark? We're going to close it out here. This is something I realized we should have gotten to when it was a little bit more timely, but I to my shame, I just hadn't thought about it at the time. It has to do with the nuclear submarines, the bit between France and Australia with the canceled deal and them repivoting. Again, I wish I brought it up at the time, but it just came back to mind, and somebody brought it up, actually. You were in charge of a nuclear reactor on a nuclear-powered cruiser for the U.S. Navy for a while there. You were the one who was actually handling the reactor itself, which means, of course, the engineering of these things decently. You probably would have stayed in touch with it. Anything that you think people might not be aware of or might not know or might find counterintuitive based on the recent deal that you would contribute? Again, kind of out of nowhere, no worries if not, Mark.
One, there is a proliferation risk because every country in the world, there's only 6 of them that has nuclear submarines, also has nuclear weapons. So there is definitely viewed as a proliferation risk there. The second thing would be that the whole reason for nuclear submarines is, in this particular instance with Australia, is the amount of time that Australia's subs can sit operationally in the South China Sea. With conventional subs, that would only be 11 days. With nuclear subs, that would be 77 days that they can park subs that are military operable in the South China Sea. And that is what it is all about.
That makes perfect sense. Mark, thank you for that.
Because of China.
Yeah, yes. Thank you for sticking with us. Mark Slavoda, International Relations and Security Analyst. Follow him on Twitter at MarkSlavoda1. Find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. Again, great conversation with Mark. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, going into a break, coming back, taking your calls for about 10 minutes here, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. For some reason, my mind goes back to China's population. The new study that's saying it could have within the next 45 years. I kind of doubt that. They're finding a replacement rate of basically a childbirth rate of 1.3 kids for every woman in the country.
Yeah.
Which is, pretty darn low. And it comes, if you think about this, just crazy culture shift for them. If you look back at the fertility rate back in like the 70s, it was like 5 or 6 kids.
Oh, wow.
So think about how much higher that is. In other words, and I'm just thinking, interested in almost culturally, like the major shift in just a couple of generations where you went from having absolutely massive families.
Just much smaller.
Much smaller. And
Government policy.
Granted, the child mortality rate was higher. They've developed a lot in terms of the health stuff since then. So it wouldn't be exactly 6 kids during that period. And it started to go down then. So, it's been petering out, but it has dropped off precipitously, and it's not rising again quickly enough from what I'm hearing. But you just culturally, it's just interesting to me how big of a change that would be.
Yeah. I mean, government basically made the decision, we're going to cut down on the number of kids. And you would think, I have a hard time seeing how that looks in the U.S. or anything like that in general, but government policy, man, and they were able to do it too well, apparently. But China is 1.5 billion people at this point. The number is either 1.3 or 1.5 billion. I think it's in between. I think it's like 1.3 something, 1.402 billion. Okay, so it has just very recently passed over the 1.4 mark, it seems. Yeah, it is a massive, massive country. So I can, I guess I can understand why they would try to limit, especially being a poor country and everything else. But at this point, I don't necessarily think they want their population to fall. But again, that's one of those things. It's like, it's hard to massage that. And I'm not saying that, right? But it's hard to kind of keep your finger on that to say, okay, we're going to, through policy, keep this number at a specific point. That it's just only going to float by so much. It seems like you're always going to either overhit it or underhit it at some point, and it seems like they're at the underhit point. But no, it's very interesting. Yeah, it's a government policy.
Yeah, it is. Well, very intentionally and controversially the world around. But I mean, this is the other conversation, and it's kind of a complicated one, I guess, because it's part of the culture war in its own way.
Yeah.
But most Western developed countries are like below the replacement rate by quite a bit. And so the narrative has become, you're dependent on immigration to keep your country relatively healthy.
Yes,
or you just accept that the future, at some point, the world gets more developed, population shrinks. Some people will say they want that, it's a good thing. Other people will call that an attempt to create a new world order or something like that. All these different theories and takes on it. And then some of the people who are opposed to the immigration taking place for various reasons are also racist, literally on their own terms, and don't want the immigration to happen because they want the countries to have their own, race, ethno-nationalism kind of a thing going on. So it's a complicated thing. But I guess my take, regardless of however you view that stuff, I like kids broadly. I think that the world should have more kids because they grow up to become people, and people are pretty cool. You know what I mean? You should make a better place for people on this world.
Well, I do think we should make a better place for people in the world. I just wish we actually did that. I mean, it's not an issue. People can become pretty cool. I think the structure that those people are grown in have a much larger effect in regards to how those people turn out. But look, man, we have all sorts of capabilities to do magnificent and wonderful things to this world. And it doesn't necessarily seem to turn that way. It goes into this notion of fear and distrust. I mean, even the missile stuff, like what always weirds me out, what I always think is odd, is we can make agreements that says, okay, we're going to have a missile treaty that says your missiles can't hit my place or they need to be this far apart and you can only allow X or you can only allow Y. That's like, great. But doesn't the very act of being able to make that treaty also means that you should be able to make other treaties? Like, it seems like it would be a slippery slope to just saying, okay, why can't we just not agree to kill each other and not waste money on this particular item? The moment that you say we're going to limit resources in our militaristic development about attacking each other, well, it seems at that point, why can't you just say, okay, we're just not going to attack each other? That doesn't seem to fly, though. It seems that even within the context of that, one country believes it has some level of an advantage, even in a negotiation, that it can win a conflict or a war with the other one with the agreement. Bolton, he was famous for like, yeah, he didn't believe in treaties or deals or anything like that, because in his head, we have an advantage and it only undermines our advantage if we ever enter into any kind of missile agreement with anybody else. But it just seems like you think of the amount of resources that we waste on that and what those resources can be used for. It's just astonishing amount of money that we just blew away.
That seems, I would get philosophical here. That comes like a seed out of human nature. It's grown in within us that we use violence, and maybe just the nature of this world. We necessarily use violence to compete over territory, whether it's physical territory or abstract territory. And, this idea that civilization is built on and built out of violence, that has some weight with me. I don't know. There are different takes on this.
The military is the beating heart of a nation.
Yeah, but I'll put it like this. As nations have gotten bigger and they've gotten more territory, as states in general, because nation states are actually a new thing, but as states, bodies, empires, whatever, tribes, you can think of these different scales of human organization. As they've gotten bigger, it seems like they've centralized the art of creating violence to the point where now every nation, if you think of it as a person, in the back of that nation's head, it's always meditating on war and competition. To the extent that it's powerful, to the extent that it's not subjugated by some other nation and therefore protected by it and under its wing, it's always ministries and often the executives. You always have some stuff churning in terms of how you're going to compete and the escalation. And what's weird, the way you set this up, the violent dynamic, even though it's contained and restrained violence, the way that you set this up is it doesn't end. It's just this escalatory arms race where we put more and more and more of our money and attention into it. But what it does end is in a war where one party wins. That's what we had after World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union, of course, won that war. And then after we realized who was still standing in the rubble, before we had time to really think through the consequences of it, the war drum started to beat off in the distance again, and pretty soon we were in the Cold War, stuck back in this cycle. That ended, thankfully, mostly peacefully with the simple collapse of the Soviet Union, although you could say that it was preceded by a great deal of potential violence and some actual violence in terms of all the proxy wars. From the American perspective, you can look at, of course, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, but there are many other smaller skirmishes. But we're gearing up, it seems, for another war. It's going to be cataclysmic. Who knows who will win? I hope that we don't get into it. I hope that we're not party to it. I hope that it doesn't happen, first and foremost. But the point is, like, the tension, the escalatory arms race aspect culminates in a war. It seems inevitably. It's just how long and how big that war is going to be, Well,
the thing is, there's no win at this point. Like, it's one thing when you had warring tribes, or if you had countries that could have these kind of intense skirmishes where one country loses and the other country goes. That's not what we have anymore. The weapons, this technology has gotten so sophisticated that the weapon systems that we're using at our disposal knock stuff out of space, destroy satellites and imaging. And any country that is about to lose that war always has the last game changer of basically the nuclear weapon that is going to fire. Meaning you can never win that contest. The best that you can do is end up with more people alive than the other group. But is it really a win if the world basically has been destroyed? We've gotten to the point where we've almost are outlawing war just because of the level of technology and fight that we have. At this point, they're just proxies. Hopefully. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Shanahan. We'll be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, folks, it's the first day of a new month. It's October 1st. It's also the last day of this week. So we've got a pairing right there. Hope everybody, we're not closing the show out yet. Just hope everybody has a great weekend. And I hope everybody had a great September. Difficult times notwithstanding. Anyway, just past 9 a.m. Eastern, that means it's time now for our third batch and last batch this morning and this week of headlines. First up in COVID news, yesterday in the United States, there were 116,090 new COVID cases reported, along with 2,744 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 111,210 cases per day. That's still a decrease of 26% from the average 2 weeks earlier, the third day in a row of 26% decreases. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated at this point, and now 65% of residents have received at least one dose. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,458,000 people across the United States, and killed 697,988 people. Merck & Co. has stated that its experimental COVID-19 pill reduced hospitalizations and deaths by half in people recently infected with the coronavirus, and they will soon ask health officials in the U.S. and around the world to authorize use. Of patients taking the medication molnupiravir, 7.3% were either hospitalized or died at the end of 30 days, compared with 14.1% who were given the placebo pill. And quick breaking news. Okay, it is breaking news. It's not huge news, but Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh has tested positive for COVID just days before the new term begins. So it is in its own way big news, but just a single person catching COVID, but an important person within our judicial system regardless. In national news, we have a government today still. I woke up, I looked outside, the sun rose, and America's government still exists. With only hours to spare, President Biden signed legislation that will avoid a government shutdown and keep it funded through December 3rd. This is, of course, after the House and the Senate voted to pass it. And now this morning, after a delayed vote last night, the Congress will reconvene to vote on today's bill. And we're going to be talking about this. You want to revisit this for we'll be talking about it with Kim. Maybe we can prime that conversation, so to speak, by coming to it in our post-headlines debrief. And a new study by The Lancet has found that more than half of police killings in the U.S. are not reported in official government data, as well as Black Americans being most likely to experience fatal police violence. An estimated 55% of deaths from police violence from 1980 to 2018 were misclassified or unreported in official vital statistics reports. This would mean about 17,100 deaths unreported during this nearly 40-year period. Governor Gavin Newsom has authorized the return of California property to descendants of a Black couple who were run out of Manhattan Beach almost a century ago. This gives reparation advocates a hope for achieving their goals in California. In international news, Kosovo and Serbia have come to a brokered deal on a border conflict that brought up old tensions after Kosovo last week sent special police to the border to remove Serbian license plates from cars entering the country and replace them with Kosovoan license plates. Protesting that rule, local Serbians had blockaded the border with trucks. Near Afghanistan's second largest city, the Kandahar Province Central General Prison is currently populated by hundreds of men, most of whom, however, are drug addicts swept from the streets of the city. Only 10% of the approximately 700 people in the prison are criminals. The rest are thought to be drug addicts at this point. That's how I saw it reported. This, of course, pairs with the conversation we were having, I believe, just yesterday with Scott Ritter, talking about opium and the Taliban, and they're profiting off that cash crop, but now deciding to reject it and effectively ban opium production, cultivation in Afghanistan, and also, of course, in this case, sweep up its effects. And I remember, throughout the war in Afghanistan, you would have these occasional video, either interviews or just people recording their time. Soldiers, I'm talking about American soldiers in Afghanistan recording their time there, basically. I know there were a couple that stood out. One was sort of from inside a company. I think it was a documentary and they were going over the recruits into the Afghan army. And most of the people were like, this is how they were painting them from the inside. They're the dregs of society.
Yeah.
These are people, many of whom, they're joining the army because it's a reliable paycheck. They're in a pretty desperate position. It's a dangerous job. And a lot of the people who are pushed to that desperation are on the lower rungs of society. A lot of those people are drug addicts. In a situation that wasn't helped by American occupation. The amount of opium production, if you look at it, the areas that were under our control, we were allowing that to take place. Remember, again, I've brought this up before. For a couple of years, I grew up in Burbank, California. A lot of my friends got addicted to heroin and other, versions of it, but specifically heroin. And if you look at where the majority of the world's heroin comes from, well, it comes from Afghanistan. And the period that they got addicted was after our occupation, of course. There's this wave that was coming over. So we saw the effects as far away as California. But it's a big problem in the region, obviously a big problem in the country. Anyway, a new study, moving on to our next headline, a new study has warned that China's population could have within the next 45 years. This comes after years of trying to control the amount of children families can have. It worked really well, a little bit too well. The current birth rate last year was 1.3 children for each woman. That fell well below the level needed to stop the population from falling. According to the study, and again, would be revising estimates. There had been a previous estimate that said 2045 comes around. The population would drop by 100 million, but dropping by half. If they're saying if the trend continues, if the replacement rate keeps going down, which frankly, I don't think it will. I think people are going to start to have more kids again. But hey, another topic. In Earth and Science news, the FAA will be looking into Jeff Bezos' company Blue Origins as multiple former employees have come out saying the company regularly engages in unsafe practices involving federal export control regulation. The Kidney Project has created a prototype bioartificial kidney, and just earlier this month won a $650,000 prize for it. This would be the first successful bioartificial kidney. You look at it, it's a machine. It's, I say bioartificial, but it looks like a machine. It looks
like a cell phone or something.
Yeah, like a cell phone or one of those small little box computers, like the Raspberry Pi, that kind of thing. It looks almost like that. It would be powered by blood flow, blood pressure. Either, probably... Still want to figure out exactly how that thing is powered by the blood. I'm just interested in that part because we were speculating, is it like a hydraulic system? Is it like capturing electrons? Is it just like a wind turbine or a water turbine, steam turbine, that kind of thing, water turbine specifically?
Like it's the blood pushing
just
through
pushing it through hydraulically.
Like a piezoelectric motor or something like that.
Exactly like that kind of thing. Anyway, we also have some holidays. Today is Chinese National Day, International Day of Older Persons, National Fire Pup Day. Those are firehouse dogs. National Homemade Cookies Day, and National Lace Day. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, coming back to this, we'll be watching for this throughout the day, although sadly I don't think we'll be able to report on it really until Monday, but we'll see how quickly this comes to pass this morning. Yeah. Of course, just different developments. The bill, which was delayed...
They don't punt again.
Assuming they don't punt again, exactly. Delayed from last night to this morning. Now, Jamarl, can you please set this up? What exactly is being decided this morning? What's on the floor, whether they delay it or pass it or whatever, vote it down, whatever?
So initially on Monday, they were supposed to be voting on the bipartisan bill. They weren't able to get an agreement, so they punted. This went all the way to Thursday. Now,
and the bipartisan bill, to be clear,
the
that's
infrastructure bill.
$500 billion-ish infrastructure bill.
Well, it's $500 billion in new spending. I think it's like $1.2 trillion total, but it's $500 billion in new spending. Yeah. And so the whole point of this for the last several months was that the bipartisan bill and $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill were linked, meaning it's all or nothing. Both of them go or neither go. Two-track solution. Pelosi knew about it. Schumer knew about it. And, of course, Joe Biden knew about it. All of them have been talking about it. And despite Joe Manchin saying, I didn't know anything about that, even Joe Manchin knew about it. And I read the quote where Joe Manchin talked about this back in either June or July. And so you had the situation where progressives kept saying, look, either you back our priorities and we back your priorities, or nobody's priorities get backed. And unlike normal, where you might have like the 6 members of the squad or wherever else, saying or making their piece, this was like 96 people. Like, so they had like a large group of people who were part of the Congressional Progressive Caucus that basically said, look, we were serious about this. We weren't playing around with this. All of it goes or none of it goes. So Pelosi, who wanted to get them to vote on the bipartisan bill has already passed the Senate. And Sanders kept saying, we're going to kill this bill. Don't test us. Well, they were going to kill the bill. Pelosi understood she didn't have the votes, and she punted it to Friday. Now, the catch becomes, what is going to take place that was different from Thursday to Friday? And they're trying to come up with some kind of agreement or framework where basically the Progressive Caucus can agree with saying, okay, we can trust this framework is sufficient enough where we believe that there will be a good faith negotiation on the other bill. Because from their standpoint, they're not voting on anything unless that is done first, because they don't trust them. It's like, if you can't trust, Manchin has gone so far to be like, I don't know, nobody said anything about bipartisan deal. Meaning, if he is basically lying about that now, at the point where you give over all of your leverage in voting for their particular priorities, they have no reason to vote for their own. And one of the things we were mentioning earlier today, and as I was trying to explain yesterday, this is not just a lefty priority stuff. This is one of those things where Biden is considering part of his legacy. He's the one that named it Build Back Better plan. That wasn't lefties naming. I'm giving it a weird name. No, that was him. Pelosi, Schumer, all of these guys sees it as their priorities. And many of the moderates who have for decades basically marginalized progressives and lefty priorities and everything else, they're on board to back this. You literally have a situation where the House could pass the bill. You have 2 members of the Senate that are against it, meaning 2 members of the Democratic Party are basically against the entirety of the party and trying to pass these agendas. And so from my standpoint, at least my thinking, is that many of the moderates who are in, let's say, in prize or in districts where they're on the front line, where they have the potential for losing, well, part of the reason that they want this passed is because it is in their best interest to get it passed. They look at it as, this is the thing that we can hang our head on and says, look at what we did. We are the Democratic Party. We said we were going to do this, and here's extra weight in your pocket. Here are policies that you can take to the bank, etc. But the catch becomes, if they can't do that, they're going to have trouble. You have a midterm. What has Joe Biden gotten accomplished? And when I say that, I make the point of saying, Donald Trump had basically passed, his own bill in regards to the COVID relief bill. So you can't even say that that's something separate and distinct that was passed. Trump was trying to pass that before Biden came in. So you can't really even give Biden entirely that much credit for that. So the catch becomes, this was the thing that they were going to hang their head on from the standpoint of legacy. And yeah, there will be serious consequences if both of those bills tank. And so the question becomes, is the left going to be able to hold the line on that? Is Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema willing to basically destroy their president's agenda in the face of their constituents, in the face of the party, and in the face of the American public overall? Because the American public overall, even in their own states, back this plan, and they back it in large, large numbers. And so we, at this point, are in kind of this limbo on what is going to happen. Now, to Joe Manchin's credit, Joe Manchin at least put out a $1.5 trillion figure that he would be open to talking about. He put this figure out, I think, back in June or July, and he basically reiterated it yesterday. Kristen Sinema hasn't done any of that. In fact, the plan, as I mentioned earlier, is supposed to be paid for. They were going to increase taxes on the rich and on corporations. Corporate taxes are basically at their lowest that they've been in God knows how long. And so the thought was, we're going to raise it. West Virginia, when they asked people, hey, are you on board for the $3.5 trillion reconciliation plan? I think the numbers were like 48%. But again, this is Trump territory. When you tell them, hey, we're going to increase taxes on the rich and corporations to pay for it, that number jumps up to like 70% support. And so the plan is definitely supported, even in these red states. No, it's these two that are basically standing in the way of progress, at least from the standpoint of the party. And I think I was making the point earlier, there should be consequences for this, and the catch becomes, what are those consequences? But either way, at this point, it is in limbo, and it is unclear on whether Biden is going to get his agenda passed. I just have a hard time believing they're going to kill both. Like, it would be shocking to me if they did that. They would basically be eating their agenda alive, not just the president's agenda alive, their capacity to retain either the House or the Senate in the midterms, which are already difficult to pull off. But if you end up in the midterms with this kind of big level failure like this on both bills, kiss it goodbye.
What if what happens, of course, we got Kim on the line, but they pass, they pass the bipartisan one. Mm-hmm. Then somewhere in this process, they dramatically curtail the extent of the other one. That seems pretty likely. Yeah. Right?
Well, it seems like that's going to happen.
They pass the scaled down version of that one. Yeah. Progressives get something. The other side gets something. Technically, you have what you always want in politics, which is a compromise between the different competing sides. But for months now, Congress will have been mired in stupid political theater, all achieving the same goal that could have been achieved in like a couple of days of outright, direct, hardball conversation, whatever. You get my point.
Yeah.
Like just getting into it. That's probably the most likely outcome. We'll come back on it. We've got Kim Iverson on the line. I don't want to hold her up too much. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute with Kim Iverson, independent journalist and host of The Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. We will be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. And we preempted this particular segment with the conversation before on the debt ceiling and the issues that are taking place. There's this kind of intra-party fight that is taking place right now. The $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill has been basically intrinsically linked to the bipartisan bill. Now, the bipartisan bill of the Build Back Better plan, as Joe Biden calls it, has already been passed through the Senate. It needs to pass through the House, but it can't pass through the House until a framework for passing the $3.5 trillion reconciliation is established. Right now, it seems like, I think the gentleman online called him the Cinemansion because it's Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema that are basically the only two Democrats standing in the way of Joe Biden's agenda. It was the agenda he campaigned on. It's the agenda he got elected on. And it's agenda that basically the party, for once, I guess in my lifetime, in its preponderance, agrees on. They're the two holdouts. And we have no idea whether or not this is going to pass either today or in the future of next week. Joining us, we have Kim Iverson. She's an independent journalist and host of The Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. Kim, thank you for joining us. I know it's early, so I appreciate you joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm actually in Idaho right now, so it's a little less early.
Oh, okay. So it's not as horrific as being in California. Okay.
No, it's now 7:20 rather than 6:20 in the morning right now.
That hurts. That hurts.
How's your dad doing, Kim?
He's great. Yeah, we just came out here to visit and to go to a Boise State football game. Cool. So I'm going to see the blue turf tomorrow.
Very
enjoy
nice.
Football. So it's going to be a fun weekend. Yeah.
Awesome. What's a blue turf? Very nice. So I know you've been paying attention to the debt fight or the budget negotiation that has been taking place. Right. What are your thoughts on this? There's so many places we can start on this, but basically, I think I've named the segment the progressives hold and Pelosi folds. And I call it that because Pelosi, for the longest time, for 3 months, had basically said, both of these bills are together, There's going to be two tracks. And then when a little stress and a little pressure started to take place where they couldn't necessarily get Manchin and Sinema on board, well, all of a sudden she says, okay, well, let's just pass the infrastructure bill. To which progressives, standing by their guns, same thing they said for the past 4 months. It's all or nothing. In which case, Pelosi had to pull the bill on Monday. She had to pull the bill on Thursday. And now they're talking about it today, but it's unclear on whether she would even get the votes for it today. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think that I don't think the progressives are going to fold on this one this time around. I don't think so. Just because of the districts that they're in, they don't really need to fold. Mm-hmm. They're not politically at risk. Whereas Sinema and Manchin obviously are in a very different situation with the districts that they're in. Whereas if they actually pass the infrastructure bill as it stands, not the infrastructure bill, the reconciliation package, then they are potentially at risk because they're coming from much more purple areas. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But I'm personally anticipating that nothing will happen, that neither bill will pass, and that the infrastructure bill will be taken up when Republicans inevitably take over Congress after the midterm election.
Oh, you think they're going to kill it entirely? Like it's just going to fail outright?
I think it will be shelved. Yeah. So I think it's probably going to fail for a while until and then I think after the midterms, we'll see how things shake out. But this is a bipartisan bill. People do want to pass this. We are going to see an infrastructure package passed at some point. I just don't know if it's going to be anytime real soon, but this is something that pretty much everybody in the country agrees needs to happen. But again, I don't think it's really politically damaging for a lot of these progressives to hold the line. Now, there are some, though, there are some that have joined the ranks holding with the progressives that maybe would be more politically at risk. And I think, of course, you'd have to go through each one of them one by one and kind of assess their districts and how red and blue they are. And even if they are blue, how progressive versus more moderate. We'd have to really look at all of that. But I anticipate nothing will happen. I don't think the progressives are going to fold. I think in this particular case, there are some that just really feel absolutely very strong. They feel very strong about this. So I don't know. I don't see why they would have any reason to back down and say, okay, fine, we'll pass the infrastructure bill. They know if they do that the reconciliation package is dead on arrival.
Yes. Yes.
That the only chance to pass the reconciliation package is to tie it directly to the infrastructure bill. And if they don't, it is dead, period. They know that.
So I guess the question becomes, are they, is this one of those things where they would be willing to take down the president's agenda? And that's the part where I hit my head on. Because I agree with you. To me, it's like it's an Olympian level of credibility loss if after 4 months of saying, we will kill it. It's all or nothing. It's all or nothing. And then all of a sudden you become, a doormat of doormats and vote on the corporate Democrats' priorities while having them basically shirk your own priorities. Everybody understood these things were linked together. And so at this point, you almost have to stand by your guns on it. By the same token, what does it mean for Joe Biden's presidency? Or for that matter, even what does it mean for Congress, meaning the moderates included in the House, in the Senate, if Biden's main economic agenda, the thing that he ran on, the thing that he won on, basically gets killed in its entirety? It's not like Joe Biden has passed and done a lot of stuff in Congress. This was basically the thing that they were basically hanging their hats on. And so is AOC, is Mama Bear, Nancy Pelosi, really not going to be able to make the case to them that, look, you can't kill it all. You can't take down Joe Biden's entire economic agenda. And do you really believe that they'll be able to hold the line on that? Or is that just, all right, we have to pass the bill. We don't have any chance. We're stuck in a rock and a hard place, as opposed to basically tanking it all? That's the part where I hit my head on. I think I agree with you, but by the same token, these guys have folded over the course of the last several decades constantly.
Right.
Why would this one be different?
Right. Yeah, and right. And you and I come from that sort of cynical perspective where we think, well, they always cave, and this is what always happens. They always kill the progressive agenda that's actually going to help the people, and they instead always go and do what's going to be favorable for the corporations, which, as we know, yes, we need infrastructure, but who benefits from that? Who's actually getting the money from infrastructure? What's going to be the big businesses that are going to be building out the infrastructure, obviously, right? The other stuff is money that actually goes to the people, and they don't want to do that. So, yeah, we've seen this time and time again. We've seen this play out over and over. We saw this even with Obamacare when they killed the single payer option. So we see this sort of thing. And so you're right. Many of us are just looking at this saying, this is par for the course and we expected this. I personally really expected this. I expected that the passing the reconciliation package would not be easy. And it's because it's rarely ever happens that something progressive for the people actually gets passed by Congress.
Well,
but another thing to really understand,
please continue.
Yeah, right. But another thing to really understand is that so Democrats don't have a majority in the Senate. They have a de facto majority in the Senate because of Kamala Harris.
Mm-hmm.
They have barely have a majority in the House. It's razor thin. So we're looking at gridlock. I mean, that is what happens when you have pretty much a 50-50 split Congress. If Democrats, this is where I kind of struggle a little bit, because I don't believe that we should just be passing large packages or, kind of forcing on half the country something that they don't want. I don't think that actually builds for a good country, good morale, good community. So even though I really want the reconciliation package, I do think that families absolutely need this. At the same time, unless Democrats can win a clear majority of seats in the House, which is, that's what's causing this problem, is that they have to negotiate with these moderate Democrats because they don't have enough votes, because the margin is razor thin and really non-existent in the Senate. So they're forced with kind of Gottheimer's 9 dealing with them, and they're forced to deal with Kristen Sinema in the Senate and whatnot. And so, unless they win a clear majority, this is what happens. This is the design of Congress, and we can't really forget that.
But to be fair,
it's meant to be sort of nothing happens when it's 50-50 like this. It's gridlock.
But to be fair, though, the overwhelming majority of the American public backs it. It's the incentives that are built into the political space that creates the problem. Like it's Sinema. I'm sorry, I keep mangled that woman's name. It's Kristen Sinema, for example, on Tuesday, dealing with and getting checks, $1,000 to $5,000 checks from people who are basically entirely against the reconciliation bill. Does that have an influence in regards to her politics? I would say decisively yes. And if you look at the majority of the people who get in Congress, 90% of the seats are won by the side with the most cash. That creates somewhat of a bias to lean towards their donor class. I mean, the weirdness or the oddity associated with this one is just, despite that razor-thin margin, like you said, 50-50 in the Senate, and I think they only have 3 votes that they can spare in the House, they still have the votes, with the exception of 2. Meaning they got the preponderance of the party overwhelmingly, with the exception of 2 holdouts. And even in the context of the country, go for it.
Right. But that's because they're, the reconciliation package. I mean, the whole point of that is to be able to force through with a simple majority.
Yes.
They really do need more. They need an actual majority. I mean, they really do need, for something this size, in order for it to go through. I mean, I do think that they would need at least 60% of the votes. I don't think they can really get it through with just forcing through.
I know, but that's because
right. I understand that, but I'm saying in principle, right? I understand the actual logistics. They don't actually have to do that. But I'm saying, more ethically, I would say, and fundamentally, if you actually want to have, if you're going to claim it's bipartisan truly, then you would need to have way more people voting for it than just a razor thin. You barely were able to get this one out. So I think they need to win more seats. And I think that the big question that needs to happen is, if this truly is extremely popular amongst the red, voting base, then why? I mean, they're going to have to hold their own leaders accountable that are going to be voting against the reconciliation package. And I don't know if we're going to see that. I actually think Republicans are going to take the House and the Senate in midterms. I actually think they're going to win more seats.
I don't think ethics applies here. And I know what you mean when you're saying it.
That doesn't sound good.
Well, I know that sounds bad, but let me explain what I mean by that. That sounds horrible. Ethics in the sense of needing both sides to basically lump in on the plan. I mean, if you look back at Obama, for example, Republicans had basically made the choice to have unyielding opposition, meaning it didn't matter what Obama came up with. They were going to be against it, even if it was stuff that they were agreeing with before. It became this kind of political machinations as opposed to actually doing what was in the best interest of the constituents. And I agree with you that this is somewhat of a Democratic plan, but within the context of the Democratic plan, you did get the 60 votes for the bipartisan, nuts and bolts and rail and everything else. It's let's say, the soft infrastructure that becomes somewhat of the issue. And again, when you're looking at the red states, you may not get 50% of Republicans that are backing it. But if you get 40% of Republicans, 60% of independents, 90% or 80% of Democrats, that is a majority. That is a clear majority that backs the plan, especially when you're talking about raising taxes on corporations or the wealthy. When you get into, creating American jobs, that number starts to go up that much higher. That's kind of the point that I'm making here. There seems to be a distinction between what members of Congress want for their kind of political calculus of that stuff versus what the American public wants. And do you agree with that?
Well, I would say that, well, yes and no. I mean, I do think that there are absolutely very popular aspects of the reconciliation package that the vast majority of Americans agree on. But there are a lot of aspects in the package that I think a lot of Americans don't. And so I think if you were to actually sample those people who do seem to support, in those red states, even Republicans who seem to support aspects of the reconciliation package, they will then turn around and say, yeah, but I don't like XYZ aspect of it. So I don't know if those people do want to pass it in its entirety as it stands, or if they'd want to see a trimmed down version of the package. So and I think that's really what the fight is about, for a lot of people.
Yes, and it's kind of what we went into before we went into our break, and we're about to go into another one. But Jamarl's a lot more familiar with this stuff than I am, and I'm sure you are too, Kim. For me, I'm trying to get my bearings on, okay, behind all of the bluster, what's the thought process? What's the inevitability? These people are players, and we're only hearing the words they're saying on their stage, but they have thoughts, and there's real competition going on behind the scenes, and there's some, what are we going to lose? What are we going to gain? That kind of thing. What's frustrating for me is how drawn out this whole thing is, and how much of the conversation, which is the important part of it, it's not the size of the bill so much as what it's going to buy us, and what specifically is in it, and whether people want that. The negotiation over that, it's like high stakes, all or nothing, that kind of, negotiation tactic, which works, but so much gets lost in it. We were talking about this yesterday with Michael Goodwin. So much of the detail gets blown out, the way the picture is being taken. Kim, before we go into our break, and we're going to be coming back talking about YouTube, Google, Facebook, big tech actions following the story from a couple of days ago, 3 days ago at this point, of RTDE, RT Germany, basically, Russia Today Germany. Two of their big channels there being taken down. We can get into why and the what of that story. But before we go into our break, Kim, it's been a little while since we've had you on. Where should people follow you? Where are the best places outside of YouTube specifically for people to follow you, keep track of your work?
Well, outside of YouTube, I'm on Rockfin. I'm going to start a Rumble channel. I haven't gotten to it yet, but I'm going to be doing that. So Rockfin, Locals, and of course I am still on YouTube, and I am co-hosting Hills Rising. So you can also see me there, still on YouTube and on Facebook, and they put Rising all over the place. So
cool.
On all the digital platforms.
That's good to hear. And congrats again on Rising. That very cool. I'm relying on my producer, Austin, to add that to your bio. Talked to him about that a second ago. And also, he comes to us with a joke. It's not about the size of the bill. It's about the motion of the notion. And I can't help but agree with that in my own way. But we're going to a break. We'll be coming back again talking about YouTube, Google, Facebook. Confluence of big tech companies deciding to suppress news they don't like and boost their own reputation, their own business. Once people are in their ecosystems, you're listening to Fault Lines. We're joined by Kim Iverson. We'll be back with her on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. By any means necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And I'll start. We're talking about big tech. We're talking about big tech suppression of speech, of channels. Specifically, this has to do with COVID stuff. And anybody who's listened to our show specifically on this channel knows, Jamarl, I think you're a bit more this way. But we're both pro-vaccine, pro-masks. We'll debate the mandate stuff. I think you're tentatively in favor of it.
51-49.
51-49, and I'm much more opposed. But we still have these kinds of conversations. Anyway, my point is that's where we are on that dispute. But we try to have these conversations, and a lot of people trying to have these conversations wherever they are on that debate. As long as they're having them seriously, it seems they're getting banned. This information is getting suppressed. This came to a head geopolitically a couple of days ago when RTDE, again, RT Germany, basically Russia Today Germany. You can think of it as Russian media in Germany on YouTube. 2 of their YouTube channels were taken down over quote-unquote COVID misinformation. Now, we scrambled to get somebody to talk about this story. We were able to get the head of online at RTDE. We talked to him yesterday and then the day before that, too, right after this stuff happened. And from the way he was describing these videos, there are 3 or 4 videos going back 6-7 months in some cases, back to February of this year. The COVID misinformation, quote-unquote, that they were describing, it's like a person from the Robert Koch Institute, which is Germany's main federal medical institute, basically saying innocuous stuff like the bureaucrats aren't handling this well, questioning whether or not you need to wear masks outside. The most gray liney thing is, if I'm in a subway car by myself, do I need to wear a mask? Which, in my opinion, is a genuine gray area that different people will answer in different ways. The point being, I paired this with Scott Gottlieb, director of the FDA under Trump from 2017 to 2019, notoriously recently called into question social distancing, whether the 6-foot number is arbitrary. He said it was. It could have been 3 feet, could have been 10 feet. They were changing the guidelines based on the rates of virality that were going on in the population at the time. My point being, he was criticizing the establishment in a similar way. Yet when those clips, the interviews with him and comments about it were aired, when it was talked about on mainstream media here in the States specifically, they let it pass because it's mainstream media. But when it's their competitors overseas, or it's when it's any random person online who decides to get involved in this conversation, they shut it down. Now, Kim, we've talked to you about this stuff enough before. I know you're critical of the way this has been handled by big tech companies. Were you familiar with this story?
I was not. I mean, it's not surprising because YouTube has come out saying that they are deplatforming, and they have. They've gone after quite a few large channels on YouTube and now even smaller channels as well in these last couple of days. So this isn't really surprising. They're going after a lot of people right now, and for old content.
I'm
going through the channels.
Since you didn't hear about it,
at, 6 months ago.
And that's what happened with the with RT.
Exactly. I'm going to be aggressive and come in because there's another big part of the story that you should know that will frame the conversation. In retaliation, a day after this happened, Russia said, we will ban YouTube if you don't undo this. So that is the level that it's gotten to. And then there's this question of if it's a tit for tat and it escalates, would that mean banning Google, who effectively owns YouTube? That's the other relevant piece of this story, but it's getting big. Kim.
Yeah, good. That's the only way to stop it. I'm much more of a free speech absolutist. I believe people should have the right to have discussions and even be contrarian and even say, I think people should be allowed to say whatever it is they want to say, quite frankly, and other people could come in with different information that tries to sway that person's mind. I don't think that censorship is ever a good idea. And if an organization, an individual, a channel, whatever it is growing an audience and people are agreeing with them, then it is even more sinister to shut it down and say, well, no, all of these people are just stupid. They're believing misinformation and they don't have a right anymore to hear it. We don't want them to hear it, and so we're going to censor it. We're going to silence it. I'm very against these actions. I just don't think they ever lead anywhere good. And I don't think historically they ever have. I don't think we have any historical examples of, yeah, this was a good thing when censorship happened. I mean, of course, there's censorship when we talk about, like lewd conduct, right? Lewd content. We don't want children coming across porn necessarily, although in Europe that's debatable, right? They don't have as big of a problem with it as we do here in the United States. So, but ultimately, I just don't think censorship is ever the answer for anything. Even if somebody is going to make a YouTube channel claiming all of the benefits of smoking and why a person should become a smoker because it's so beneficial for their health, I think ultimately the overwhelming information coming out at people is that, smoking gives you cancer and smoking leads to all of these other health ramifications. And so I think a person should be able to hear it all and make up their own mind. But, Russia going after Google or YouTube is the only way to start to actually shift the dynamic and the power of these big tech companies. They have way too much power. And so governments around the world really should be shutting them down in order to limit their power, because they are shaping public discourse and they are meddling in our elections, no matter how you slice it. These big tech companies are the true meddlers because they're the ones that are controlling it. And, when they're able to deplatform the president of the United States and potentially not allow, I mean, we don't know if Donald Trump were to run again, for example, in 2024, would they replatform him or would they not? And if they don't, do you consider that meddling in our election?
Yeah.
I mean, they have way too much power. They have way too much power.
That I agree with. They're shaping reality in a particular way. You said a lot there. Some of it I agree with, some of it I don't. I mean, if you had a situation of people like join ISIS, and you have, putting out propaganda for the ISIS and whatnot, that's soliciting money for basically terrorist actions, let's say in the United States, you will probably get a large number of people that will pay it no mind. But the people who do pay it mind, you could basically create a center of support of people like-minded all across the United States that basically use that particular platform as a way of clumping together under this notion of let's have terrorist attacks on home soil. Or what about the Stop Kim Iverson channel? It's like, hey, we love Kim Iverson. She's phenomenal. And you have all of these people lumping together, coming up with this kind of analysis of where is she located? Let's go find her. Let's hang out at her place. I think you would have great qualms with that. I mean, certainly there had to be some kind of, I guess my thing is the absolutist thing. How radical are you from the standpoint of a free speech absolutist? Fire in a theater?
Well, I don't think that you should be able to say things that are illegal. So if you are doxing a person, doxing should be illegal, right? So if you're calling for harm on somebody, that's illegal.
That's fair.
I don't think you can promote illegal activity. But beyond that, when it comes to ideas, thoughts, calling things into question, I mean, look, I've thought about this a lot because I thought, well, should somebody be allowed to go, let's say, all over YouTube and talk about smoking and say smoking is really beneficial for you? And what kind of drove me to that conclusion of, I guess they should be allowed to do that is because the wine industry does it, right? I mean, they go around, drinking wine is good for your system. That's great for your blood. Like, never mind all of the negative effects of alcohol. Never mind all of the thousands upon thousands of people that alcohol has killed, right? You're still allowed to go around saying that wine is a good thing for you to have in your system, that it's good for your circulation.
And I'm sure at a certain point,
you should be allowed.
Smoking cigarettes de-stresses you. You smoke a cigarette here or there. It's the same thing, right?
Yeah. Right. So I think, I think people should be allowed to share their opinions, and even stuff that, and especially when it comes to the pandemic, we don't know a lot still about the virus. We don't know a lot about what is working. We don't know a lot about the treatments. I mean, there's still so many unknowns. So to block any of that information to me is totally and utterly bizarre. I don't know why we're being told we cannot even question the authorities at all when it comes to any of this. We're not allowed to ask a single question about true effectiveness, or even some of the negative ramifications. Now we're finding out that during the lockdowns, which I was a very big anti-lockdown person, now we know that lockdowns have caused skyrocketing rates of obesity. Guess what we also know? We also know that in younger people, you are at a higher risk of a very severe COVID outcome if you are obese. So now we've created a situation where we have more people who are higher risk for severe COVID outcomes.
And alcoholism.
And we're seeing that in the hospitals.
You brought up alcohol a couple of minutes ago. Rates of alcoholism have been skyrocketing. I've been drinking more. I don't think I qualify as an alcoholic, but I have been drinking more. Should probably drop a couple of there, and I've started to. The beer specifically, it's mostly the weight at this point, I'll be honest. And it lowers your testosterone over time, which for me is like, I don't want that kind of thing. But anyway, I'm reminded of it's a little bit of an esoteric reference, but as long as we're talking about science, reminded of the Royal Society, like the English-British Royal Society, you know, old scientific institution, practically the preeminent example for how this is supposed to work, the kind of community you want to spread. Their motto, nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it. Look into it yourself. And I don't know how you're supposed to do that. That's the translation. Look, you know, take nobody's word for it. I don't know how you're supposed to do that if you can't, if they're blocking all inquiry other than establishment condoned sources. That's the exact opposite of what you want. And I don't say this, it's the same thing. It comes back, you know, even you can relate, you brought up kids being able to watch porn in Europe. I'll start from that and move back into this conversation. The state there is saying effectively, this is a conversation I imagine happening. Kids shouldn't be able to watch this stuff. Or broadly, if you step back from that, it should be on the parents' end to make sure that they raise their kids in a way that protect them from that. That's a little bit more libertarian or something. And then the state is like, well, we can't do that. You know, they decide to get involved. They decide to prevent people from watching it. There's a conversation there that happens. But what's in that conversation is it should be on the individual's end to figure this stuff out. It should be on the parents' end to figure out how they're supposed to do it. And then the state gets in when they see that consistently that's not happening. On this end, with COVID misinformation, the state has a policy they're wanting to push, for better and for worse. They're trying to handle this in the way they're trying to handle it. And they don't trust people to think this stuff through on their end. They're trying to control what they think, because they believe that they know more than most people, even though these people probably don't think they're perfectly right about everything. But they're like, we're going to try to control it anyway. They try to do that, and like you were saying, it just seems to backfire. And I'm worried about on the lowest, you know, the lowest and the highest levels all around. We move away from science into politics, into anything. The CIA going after Assange, trying to kill him. These different ways in which information that is critical to what the establishment is pushing is controlled. It is super, super worrying. And anybody if you're in media and you're not talking about this stuff, you're not calling it out, you're killing yourself in the long run. Kim, we're almost out of time, but what's your take?
The problem is that those of us who do call it out are constantly at risk of being deplatformed.
Yeah.
So it's how to, and then that scares a lot of people who have their livelihood in media. They don't want to call it out. They don't want to lose their jobs, especially in the mainstream media. They don't want to lose their lucrative multi-million-dollar contracts. And so they don't say anything. And that is where we're at. And it's extremely dystopian.
Kim, what should be done from the standpoint of policy on this? Meaning, you know, whether it's the issue in Germany, whether it's in the United States, YouTube, and look, you know, both of us have had channels, and it is an aggravating system to work with. I mean, they can go back over something 8 months, a year, say, hey, this thing that you put out a year ago, you know, breaches our rules for today, and so we're going to take your channel down for X amount of time, without even really giving you the specifics of why or what it does, and for that matter, being completely unaccountable. So there's no real debate in regards to what's going on. I mean, the case that we're talking about that took place in Germany, they didn't even explain what was the offending content, meaning what was wrong. They just said, hey, you need to fix these videos. And those videos were like 8 months prior, like 8, 6, and X number of months prior. So from a legal standpoint, at the very least specific to the United States, what needs to be done? I mean, is this turning them into, is this making them available to free speech laws in some kind of a way? Is this turning them into a utility? Like, what's the solution to this?
I mean, I definitely think, it's a tough question. I think they need to be deemed a utility, and that they should be regulated as such, to where they are just connecting people and they're not allowed to actually interfere. It's like you can't tell someone they can't have a telephone line because you don't like their politics, right? So they should be regulated in that same exact way. But I think that the pressure is just going to have to come from governments, quite frankly. I think it's going to take, if Russia starts it and says, okay, well, then we're banning you. I know Australia also had threatened to ban Facebook, I believe, for something. I don't remember exactly what it was over, but I think advertisements of some sort. But, if it would just take more governors in states. I would imagine Ron DeSantis probably coming out with something similar to what Russia's doing, saying, hey, if you do this, then we're just going to completely not allow you to do business in our state. It would take countries and just them all coming together and saying, we're not going to allow this level of meddling in our lives, because that is what's happening now, is that these big tech companies are meddling in our lives, claiming that they're somehow benefiting our lives. I don't understand it myself.
I hear you. I hear you on that. Well, and if Russia decides to do this, if that's what it comes to, that's 144 million people fewer for YouTube to advertise to have on their platforms. Granted, there's going to be some, there are going to be language divides, there are going to be things like that, but it affects their bottom line. Kim, thank you for joining us this morning. Great talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It was awesome. Hopefully again soon. It's been awesome seeing you blow up over at the Hill Rising when you were, and you still are, of course, doing stuff when you were actively co-hosting there. Kim Iverson, independent journalist and host of the Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. Watch her show on YouTube at youtube.com/Kim Iverson. Also watch it at rockfan.com/Kim. Check her out on Twitter at Kim Iverson Show. She's back on Twitter. She has returned. And also check out when she's on The Hill Rising. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into our break, coming back, taking your calls, 202-521-1320, and talking about the plight and the fate decided today of one Stephen Donziger.
Yep.
We're going to be getting into that story, revisiting that as, again, his court hearing, the decision on this taking place this morning over, we'll get into it. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show.
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking your calls and talking Stephen Donziger. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that is 202-521-1320. Stephen Donziger is a busy man today. He's being sentenced this morning, and we had him on to talk about it a couple of times now. Major story. I want to get him on to talk about it, of course, after the sentencing this next week, when he is less busy and we know what will have happened. But I just wanted to make sure, and thank you, Austin, for the reminder. We were talking about this. I want to make sure that we get some time in to, revisit this story, the big deal. Basically, setting this up for people. He was in charge of protecting indigenous peoples against Chevron, who had basically in Ecuador been contaminating the local environment for a long time, leading to serious long-term medical conditions. He was representing them and got a victory.
$9.5 billion judgment.
Yep, in Ecuador.
Yep.
And then was retaliated against by Chevron, has been locked in this case under house arrest for over 2 years at this point. Long darn time.
Not just that. Just the hysteria associated with it. They basically, the government of the U.S. wouldn't bring a case. Basically, they didn't see the reason to bring a case. And so they didn't do it. However, the judge, with connections to to Chevron, brings in private attorneys to prosecute him, if I'm not mistaken, under racketeering laws. Very weird stuff. Consider for the moment, they tried to push this case to the U.S. government multiple times, and the government refused to do it multiple times.
Yeah.
The judge took it upon himself to basically to push this through and send it to a private lawyer, private law firm. Again, a law firm with connections to Chevron. It's like all of these people have either connections or some kind of fiduciary relationship with a company to which he is battling with. And in this case, he's been at home under detention with a thing on his leg for the past, year or 2 years or something? Mm-hmm. Some insane amount of time, 700 and some days.
Right.
787 days on house arrest.
As of today, you can check this out at freedonziger.com, by the way.
Yeah, it's just extreme stuff. With this case, it's just it is astonishing that something like this could happen to a person. And, just to make the point, the UN finds Stephen Donzinger's house arrest violates international law, says it is appalled by it, and, demands his release. Well, not just not getting the release, apparently the sentencing is today.
And they were, specifically, UN experts were appalled by the judge.
Mm-hmm.
You remember the second judge in this case, Loretta Preska?
Yeah.
The one who was so negligent in court, so not there, so already decided.
She was reading a newspaper
in the courtroom.
Yep.
While she was supposed to be paying attention to what was actually being said and deliberated on. We've got calls, and I said we'd take them. I just wanted to make sure we got that in a couple of minutes. Thanks again for the reminder on that, Austin. And please, people, again, freedonziger.com if you want to give the guy some support. His case is being decided. He's being sentenced this morning in New York City. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Let's go to Brave, calling in from Atlanta. Brave. Oh, wait, sorry. I'm skipping a guy. Of course. Tarif, you called in early, and so, we have our chat room, and things just get out of order. I'm sorry, Brave. I'll come back to you. Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. You're on the line. What's on your mind, man?
I have two comments. First, I'd like to say free Julian Assange, free Donziger, and our hands off Haiti. The Australian Foreign Minister Maurice Payne raised the case of WikiLeaks co-founder Julian Assange with the U.S. Secretary of State during her visit to Washington, D.C. this month. And also the Parliament is asking for the release of Julian Assange. And my second comment is dealing with Aaron Melte had tweeted out something about 10 hours ago about the Durham case, that Durham sent out more subpoenas. The story begins with, Special Counsel John Durham has issued a new set of subpoenas, including to a law firm with close ties to Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. In addition to that, Durham could be
Perkins Coie.
He could be trying to build a broader criminal case, according to People Brief on the matter. So we'll see about that too. That's all I want to say.
Arif, thanks for the two updates there. And by the way, I saw this reported yesterday, either overnight or last night. The first tech executive, remember we were speculating who would be, there was this unnamed tech executive who had provided information to Michael Sussman that he then took to the FBI while saying that he wasn't representing a client, basically.
Yeah.
But providing this
Basically
information.
lying.
When he was lying. That's what the indictment is about. We'd been speculating with a couple of our guests on who that was. Could it be Dmitry Alperovich, the CTO of CrowdStrike? I believe that one of our later guests on, I'm forgetting exactly who, might have been Dan Lazar, but I might be misremembering, brought up Eric Schmidt from Google. I think it was Lee, actually. Possibly Eric Schmidt from Google, because he has these contacts. Turns out is this other dude who had previously received an award from the FBI. I saw this come in last night from Bob Schlehuber, actually, over at Political Misfits. But it is another guy who I still want to look into more. I want to understand what exactly the connections are there. But just a brief update to that story. Tarif, thank you for the call. Brave, going to you now. We've got about a minute here. What's on your mind, Brave?
Good morning. Two things real quickly. I would say everybody that can or should be interested should go to congress.gov and read HR 36. Make some attempt to try to read 3684. It's 2,000 something pages as it stands right now.
Oh, you can't say that. Oh, did you say flipping?
What?
No, I thought I misheard you. I thought I heard you curse.
HR
I'm sorry.
3684.
I'm on a hair trigger with this. Go on, Brave.
I'm pretty good. No, everybody should, if they can, go try and read it just so you can get some information, because we can't trust these people. There's no reason to trust these people, and the only way we'll know what's going on is if we try to dig into these bills. And in a 2,000-page bill, I'm pretty sure those politicians have not read it. They're just trying to pass it, and the media is definitely not concerned with digging into it. So I guess everybody should take it on their own to try and read as much as they can and get as much information as they can. And I'll leave it at that.
Brave, thank you for the call. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Brave, Tarif, everybody. I want to thank engineer Andre, producers Cordell Woodland and Austin Pelly, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host, of course, all of our guests this morning. Good conversations. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kim. And thank you for listening to this morning show and this week's show. We'll be back on Monday, folks, 7 a.m. Eastern. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan signing off this weekend. See you on the other side.